Before written history, before empires, before the myths we call mythology, there were others. Deep beneath the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have unearthed something that refuses to fit neatly into what we thought we knew. Texts older than the pyramids. Cylinder seals depicting beings that shouldn't exist. Astronomical knowledge that took humanity millennia to rediscover. Who were the Anunnaki? Gods? Rulers? Something else entirely? The ancient Sumerians weren't vague. They were specific, and that specificity is what keeps historians up at night. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into one of history's most electrifying unsolved puzzles. Somewhere beneath the sun-bleached plains of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers once ran full and generous through a landscape that no longer remembers its own fertility, there is a city that time buried and forgot. Its name was Nippur, and before Nippur, there was Eridu. Before Eridu, according to the people who lived there was something else entirely. The soil here is layered like a book. Archaeologists who first broke ground in the 19th century were not prepared for what they found. Not just pottery shards or animal bones, but libraries. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, pressed with a script so precise and so dense that scholars spent decades learning simply how to read it. When they finally did, the story that emerged was not what anyone expected. It was not a simple story of early agriculture or primitive governance. It was a cosmology, a theology, a detailed, internally consistent account of creation, kingship, and the origins of the human race, written by people who believed, with apparent conviction, that they had not built civilization on their own. They called them the Anunnaki. The word itself is Sumerian, and its translation has been debated for over a century. The most widely accepted rendering is something close to those of royal blood or princely offspring, though some scholars have proposed those who came from heaven to earth, a reading that is proven considerably more controversial. In the Sumerian literary tradition, the Anunnaki are not metaphors. They are not symbolic stand-ins for natural forces, the way later mythological systems sometimes use divine figures to personify wind or sea. The Sumerians describe the Anunnaki with a specificity that is, at minimum, unusual. They had names. Enlil, the lord of wind and authority. Enki, the god of water, wisdom, and what the texts call the deep. Inanna, whose stories fill more surviving tablets than almost any other figure in the ancient world. Ninhursag, described repeatedly as a mother creator, and above them all, a figure named Anu, sky, father, origin point, the source from which the name Anunnaki itself derives. They held councils, they argued, they issued decrees, they made errors and corrected them. They grew frustrated with the noise of humanity and debated what to do about it. One text, known as the Atrahasis Epic and dated to roughly 1700 BC, describes a great flood sent not out of moral judgment, but out of something closer to exhaustion. The gods could no longer sleep. If this sounds familiar, it should. Scholars have noted the structural parallels between these Mesopotamian accounts and later flood narratives, including those found in Hebrew scripture. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains perhaps the most famous version, a tale of a single righteous man, a boat, and a world remade by water, and it predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years. The connections between these traditions are not fringe speculation. They are mainstream academic consensus. What is not consensus is what to make of the Anunnaki themselves. For most historians and archaeologists, the answer is relatively straightforward. The Anunnaki are gods, powerful anthropomorphized deities created by a civilization trying to explain the world around it. The Sumerians, like every early culture, looked at the chaos of existence, flood, drought, disease, harvest, and gave it faces, gave it names, built temples to honor it and rituals to appease it. This interpretation is not dismissive. It takes the Sumerians seriously as sophisticated thinkers. The Anunnaki myths in this reading are elaborate theological and philosophical frameworks, humanity's earliest attempts to understand power, origin, and moral order. The fact that these stories contain so much detail, so much internal logic, so much consistency across centuries of retelling speaks to how seriously the Sumerians took them. It is a persuasive argument. And yet, there are details in the Sumerian texts that mainstream interpretation tends to pass over quietly. The Anunnaki are described in multiple independent sources as having come from somewhere, not metaphorically, geographically. The texts refer repeatedly to a place, sometimes called the Abzu, a kind of primordial underground ocean associated with Enki, sometimes referenced in connection with the heavens in ways that feel less poetic and more directional. Enlil descends. Enki descends. Anu, in the texts, dwells above. Not in a vague spiritual sense, but in a way the ancient scribes seem to have considered literal. There is also the question of what the Anunnaki are described as doing when they arrive. They are not worshipped passively. They are recorded as being actively present, building, organizing, teaching. The texts describe the Anunnaki establishing the first cities, introducing agricultural techniques, bringing what the Sumerians called the Me, a set of divine laws or civilizational blueprints that covered everything from kingship and priesthood to music, metalworking, and the descent into the underworld. Why would a purely mythological tradition require its gods to function as engineers? It is at this point that the road forks, and it is worth walking a short distance down both paths without pretending either leads to certain ground. The theory most associated with the late Zecharia Sitchin holds that the Anunnaki were not mythological at all, that they were extraterrestrial beings who arrived on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, intervened in human evolution, and eventually departed, leaving behind a civilization sophisticated enough to remember them, but not sophisticated enough to understand what it had witnessed. Sitchin's reading of the Sumerian texts is contested. Many scholars dispute his translation specifically, arguing that he extracted meanings the original language does not support. But his core question, why do these texts read the way they do, has never been entirely dismissed to everyone's satisfaction. A different fringe interpretation places the Anunnaki within the context of a pre-Diluvian civilization, a lost human culture of extraordinary sophistication that existed before a global catastrophic event and was simply erased from the geological record. In this reading, the Anunnaki are not gods and not aliens, but ancestors, the memory of a world that came before. The Sumerians, according to this view, were not inventing theology. They were preserving history. And then there are those who look eastward and westward simultaneously, tracing linguistic and mythological parallels between the Anunnaki and the Nephilim of Hebrew tradition, the Watchers described in the Book of Enoch, the fallen figures of Vedic cosmology in ancient India, the sky beings referenced in texts from Mesoamerica to Egypt. No single culture, these researchers argue, would independently produce such consistent imagery. Something, or someone, must connect them. The Sumerians were not primitive. This is perhaps the most important corrective to apply before any theory is entertained. The civilization that produced the Anunnaki texts also produced the world's first known legal code. Its first recorded literary author, a woman named Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god Nana, writing around 2300 BC. Its first astronomical tables, its first schools, its first love poetry. These are not the artifacts of a people who did not understand the difference between story and reality. When they wrote about the Anunnaki, they were not daydreaming, they were documenting, whether what they documented was theology, memory, or something else entirely. That is the question no one has yet been able to answer with full confidence. The tablets that survive represent, by most estimates, only a fraction of what was once written. The libraries of Nippur and Nineveh were vast. Wars, floods, centuries of neglect. They have taken their toll. What remains is extraordinary. What is gone may have been more so. Somewhere beneath the desert plains of what was once called the cradle of civilization, the excavations continue. New tablets are found, new translations proposed, new arguments made and challenged. And still, when you hold a photograph of one of those ancient cylinders, pressed thousands of years ago by hands that believed they were recording something true, and you read the words that have survived, one question seems to hover over everything like smoke above a dying fire. Were the Anunnaki the gods the Sumerians invented to explain a world they could not understand? Or were they something the Sumerians understood far better than we do, and we are simply the ones who have forgotten? Before moving to the next mystery, if you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. And so the question of who the Anunnaki were leads, almost inevitably, to a second question. One that cuts deeper. One that civilizations across every continent and every era have asked in their own language, in their own darkness, looking up at the same stars. Where did we come from? It is a question science has answered, to a degree. Evolution, adaptation, millions of years of biological trial and error written into our DNA like a very long, very patient letter. The broad outline is not seriously contested, and yet, even within that outline, there are gaps. Moments where the expected gradual progression seems to stutter, or lurch, or skip ahead in ways that continue to generate debate among the very scientists who study it most closely. The Sumerians had their own answer, and it was not vague. Consider the city of Eridu. It sits today as a mound of dust and broken brick in the southern Iraqi desert, not far from the ancient shoreline of what was once a much larger Persian Gulf. It is, by most archaeological consensus, the oldest city ever found. Its foundation layers date to somewhere around 5400 BC, though some researchers place its earliest occupation earlier still. When excavators first reached its lowest strata in the 1940s, they found temple remains. Not homes, not markets. A temple built first, at the very bottom of the city's memory. The Sumerians themselves believed Eridu was where civilization began, not metaphorically. They had a document, known today as the Sumerian King List, that recorded every ruler from the earliest dynasties down through centuries of known history. It is a remarkable artifact. Much of its later content has been independently verified against other sources. Kings who appear on the list turn up in inscriptions, in administrative records, in correspondence found hundreds of miles away. But the King List does not begin with verified history. It begins with something else. It begins before the flood. And the reigns it records for those earliest rulers are not measured in years. They are measured in what the text calls sars, units that some translators render as periods of 3,600 years each. The first king listed, a figure named Alulim, is said to have reigned in Eridu for 28,800 years. His successor, Al-Algar, for 36,000. 8 kings in total, ruling across 5 cities for a combined span that stretches back, if taken literally, hundreds of thousands of years. Then the flood came. And after the flood, the list notes simply, kingship descended from heaven again. Mainstream scholarship treats these numbers as symbolic, a literary device used to convey the immense antiquity and divine authority of the earliest rulers. That is a reasonable interpretation. But it is worth sitting with the alternative for a moment, not because it is necessarily correct, but because the Sumerians themselves gave no indication they considered it symbolic. They recorded it the same way they recorded everything else, with the same careful hand, the same deliberate impression into wet clay. The story of human creation in Sumerian literature centers on a text known as the Atrahasis epic, the same text that contains the flood narrative, along with related accounts found across multiple tablet collections. The story they tell, assembled from fragments and cross-referenced over decades of scholarly work, goes something like this. The Anunnaki, in the earliest times, performed their own labor. They dug the rivers, they shaped the land. They worked, according to the text, for 40 periods of time. The word used suggests something closer to geological epochs than human generations. And eventually, they grew weary. There was complaint, something approaching revolt among the lesser divine workers, a group the texts call the Igigi. The situation, as the scribes recorded it, became untenable. It was Enki who proposed the solution, and Ninhursag, the mother goddess, the one whose name means Lady of the Sacred Mountain, who carried it out. They would create a worker, something capable of bearing the labor the gods no longer wished to perform. The text describes a process: clay, mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain divine being, shaped and animated into a new kind of creature. The word used for this creation is Lulu, sometimes translated as primitive worker, sometimes simply as human being. The language is mythological. Of course it is. But the structure of what is being described, an existing intelligent species deliberately engineering a new biological entity to serve a specific purpose, is a narrative framework that has no real parallel in other ancient creation traditions. Most cultures describe humanity as an afterthought, or an accident, or a beloved creation shaped from longing or love. The Sumerian account is notably transactional. We were made because we were needed. Whether that detail is theology, metaphor, or something stranger is a question worth holding. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. Within decades, the framework of natural selection had reshaped how the educated world understood human origins. By the 20th century, the fossil record was being assembled piece by piece. Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, each species slotting into a long, slow progression spanning millions of years. The broad shape of that story remains intact, but within it, a specific puzzle has occupied paleoanthropologists for generations. Roughly 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans appear in the fossil record with a relative suddenness that the gradual model struggles, at times, to fully account for. Not overnight. Nothing in evolution happens overnight, but faster than many researchers expected. Faster in some analyses than the standard rate of mutation and natural selection alone would comfortably predict. The debate is technical, ongoing, and fiercely contested within the scientific community. Most researchers believe the explanation lies in Africa, in environmental pressures, in genetic bottlenecks, in mechanisms that are not yet fully understood but are, in principle, entirely natural. That remains the scientific consensus, and it is not lightly dismissed. But the timing sits in an uncomfortable proximity to certain claims in the Sumerian texts. Not proof of anything, not even, strictly speaking, evidence. Just a coincidence of chronology that some researchers have found difficult to ignore entirely. Zecharia Sitchin, whose work remains polarizing decades after its publication, argued that the Sumerian creation story was not metaphor, but documentation. That the Lulu was a genetic hybrid, existing hominid DNA combined with something introduced from outside. That the Anunnaki were the engineers. That what the ancient scribes recorded as divine intervention was, in functional terms, a biological procedure. Sitchin's linguistic methodology has been seriously challenged. Scholars of Assyriology have pointed out specific translation choices they consider unjustifiable, readings that stretch the original Sumerian beyond what the grammar will support. These are legitimate criticisms, and they matter. But Sitchin was not the last person to ask these questions. In recent decades, a number of researchers working from genetics rather than mythology have noted anomalies in the human genome, specific gene sequences, chromosomal arrangements, patterns of inheritance that appear to some analysts inconsistent with purely gradual natural development. The scientific establishment regards most of these claims with considerable skepticism, and the peer review process has not been kind to several of them. But the conversation has not entirely gone away. In 2013, researchers mapping ancient human DNA confirmed that modern Homo sapiens carry a small but measurable percentage of Neanderthal and Denisovan genetic material, evidence of interbreeding between species that was, until recently, considered unlikely. The boundaries between human species, it turned out, were more porous than the textbooks had assumed. The story of how we became what we are is more complicated, more layered, and more surprising than any single theory has yet fully captured. That much, at least, is beyond dispute. There is a clay tablet in the collection of the British Museum. It is not the most famous artifact in that building. It sits among tens of thousands of others, cataloged and studied and photographed and argued over. But what is pressed into its surface, in neat cuneiform rows dating to roughly 2000 BC, is a creation account that describes, in careful detail, the mixing of divine material with earthly clay, the animation of a new being, and the explicit transfer of knowledge, of consciousness, of language, of what the text calls the knowing of all things, into that being at the moment of its creation. The Sumerians did not describe humanity as animals elevated by time. They described us as beings made deliberately, with intention, and given something specific at the moment of our making. Whether that something was divine grace, biological inheritance, or a form of knowledge transferred by beings more advanced than ourselves. The text does not say. It simply records that it happened, that we were given what we needed to become what we are. And here is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. Unsettling not because it confirms any particular theory, but because of what it implies about the people writing it. The Sumerians did not seem to find their own creation story humbling. They did not record it as a tragedy or a diminishment. They recorded it as an origin, a beginning, something to be understood and honored, not mourned. They knew what they were, or at least they believed they did. Several thousand miles west of Eridu, beneath the limestone plateau of what is now southern Turkey, there is a site called Göbekli Tepe. It was built, assembled, designed, deliberately constructed, at least 11,500 years ago, possibly earlier. Its T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing 20 tons, are carved with animals and abstract symbols with a sophistication that should not, by everything we previously understood about that period, exist. This was not a civilization with writing, with agriculture, with the organizational infrastructure we associate with monument building. And yet there it is. Circles of stone, set with precision, oriented to the sky, built by people whose identity we do not know and whose purpose we cannot fully determine. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Whoever built it filled it in with rubble and soil around 8000 BC, entombing it carefully, as if preserving it, as if leaving something behind for someone who would come later. It predates Eridu. It predates the Sumerian king list. It predates every text we have ever found. And carved into one of its central pillars, among the animals and symbols, there is a human figure, arms at its sides, head lowered, standing in a posture that some researchers describe as reverence and others describe simply as waiting. Waiting for what? No one has been able to say. The Sumerian texts tell us we were made from clay and something divine, shaped by hands that were not human, given knowledge we did not earn, and set to work in a world we did not build. Science tells us we emerged from a long, complex, still not fully understood process of biological development that accelerated at a certain point in ways that continue to generate questions. Neither account is complete. Both contain real evidence. Both contain gaps large enough to walk through. What sits in those gaps, whether it is simply the ordinary darkness of incomplete knowledge or something that the oldest human records have been quietly pointing toward for 6,000 years, is a question that no institution, no laboratory, and no library has yet definitively closed. We know what we are. We can map our genome, trace our ancestry, date our bones. But the question of how we became what we are, the precise mechanism, the full story, the unedited account of that first transition from whatever we were before to whatever we became after, remains, in the most honest terms available, open. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is this. the people of ancient Sumer, writing on clay in a language that died and had to be resurrected letter by modern scholars, seem to believe they already knew the answer. Whether they were right is the question that refuses to go away. If they were real, in whatever form that reality took, then at some point they left, or they withdrew, or they were forgotten so completely that the forgetting itself became a kind of disappearance. The Sumerian texts, so precise and so detailed in their descriptions of the Anunnaki's presence, are considerably less clear on the matter of their absence. There is no single tablet, no definitive inscription, no carved farewell. The Anunnaki do not depart in one clean moment. They simply recede. Like a tide that goes out so gradually you don't notice the waterline has changed until the beach is empty and the horizon looks different, and you cannot quite remember when the water was last at your feet. That recession is its own kind of mystery. And to understand it, you have to go back to the cities, stand at the edge of what remains of Ur. Not the Ur of Abraham, the Ur of later biblical tradition, though that association has generated its own centuries of debate. But older Ur, the Ur that predates the patriarchs by thousands of years, the Ur whose royal cemetery, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, yielded treasures of such extraordinary craftsmanship that Woolley himself initially refused to believe what he was looking at. Gold headdresses, lyres inlaid with lapis lazuli and shell, jewelry of a delicacy that modern craftsmen have struggled to replicate even with contemporary tools. And beneath the treasures, something darker, the remains of dozens of attendants, soldiers, musicians, court officials, all buried alive with their rulers in what Woolley called the Great Death Pits. Men and women who had dressed in their finest, taken their positions and swallowed poison so that they might accompany their king into whatever came next. What compels a civilization to do that? What vision of the afterlife? What understanding of divine hierarchy? What absolute certainty about the nature of power and death could produce that kind of willing submission? The Sumerians believed their kings were not merely rulers. They were intermediaries, the living bridge between the human world and the world of the Anunnaki, the physical point of contact between what was visible and what was not. When the king list records that kingship descended from heaven, it is not using a poetic flourish. It is making a theological claim about the origin and nature of authority itself. And in the later periods of Mesopotamian history, something about that claim begins to shift. The 3rd millennium BC is the high watermark of Sumerian civilization. The cities are at their most organized, their most productive, their most architecturally ambitious. The ziggurats, those massive step temple mountains that dominate the ancient skyline of every major Mesopotamian city, are built or expanded during this period. They are not palaces. They are not public buildings in any civic sense. They are, according to every available textual source, houses. Houses built for the gods. Structures designed to provide a dwelling place for divine beings who are expected, at least in theory, to actually inhabit them. The ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, still partially stands. Its lower stages survive to a height of around 30 feet, though the original structure was considerably taller. At its summit, according to ancient descriptions, there was a single room, simply furnished, a bed, a table, food left each night by a priestess who then departed before darkness fell, leaving the space empty and waiting. Waiting for an occupant who, at some point in the long slide of centuries, appears to have stopped arriving. Because by the 2nd millennium BC, roughly 2000 to 1000 BC, the theological language of Mesopotamian civilization begins to change in ways that are subtle, but unmistakable to scholars who study the progression. The gods are still named, the temples are still maintained, the rituals are still performed with meticulous care, but the tone of the texts shifts. The intimacy disappears. In the earliest Sumerian literature, the Anunnaki are described as present. Enki walks through his temple. Inanna descends. Enlil speaks directly to kings in language that reads less like vision and more like conversation. The divine and the human occupy the same world, imperfectly but genuinely. By the time you reach the Babylonian period, that proximity is gone. The gods have become remote. Prayers are petitions sent upward into silence, not exchanges with beings in the next room. The literature of this later period is full of lament. Texts in which the writers mourn the withdrawal of divine attention, ask what they have done to deserve abandonment, plead for a return that never quite seems to come. One text, known as the Babylonian Theodicy and dated to around 1000 BC, reads almost like a philosophical argument with an absent god. A series of carefully structured complaints about the indifference of the divine, the suffering of the righteous, the apparent silence of heaven. It is a document born of distance, of the felt experience of being separated from something that was once closer. What happened in the space between those two periods, between the intimate divine presence of early Sumer and the theological longing of later Babylon, is not recorded anywhere in plain terms. But the change is real, and it is documented, and it spans roughly 1,000 years of gradual withdrawal. Mainstream scholarship has a coherent explanation for this trajectory. Civilizations evolve, religious systems mature. The anthropomorphic, physically present gods of early cultures tend over time to become more abstract, more transcendent, more philosophically sophisticated as the societies that worship them grow in complexity. The shift from intimate to distant deity is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears in Egypt, in early Greek religion, in the transformation of Vedic tradition into classical Hinduism. It is, in this reading, a natural development of theological thought. That explanation accounts for the literary evidence well, but it does not fully account for one recurring element in the later Mesopotamian texts, an element that appears too consistently to be coincidental. The later texts do not describe the gods as having become abstract. They describe them as having gone somewhere. There are references, scattered across multiple cuneiform collections, to a withdrawal that was deliberate, a departure that was chosen. Texts in which the Anunnaki are described as having returned to a place the scribes call the upper world or the celestial realm, language that, in the earliest periods, referred to an actual location, not a spiritual state. There are passages that read as records of a transition point, a moment when the direct governance of human civilization by divine beings ended and was replaced by the institution of human kingship as a kind of proxy administration. The king list itself encodes this. The impossibly long reigns of the pre-flood kings, those hundreds of thousands of years of divine rule, give way abruptly, after the flood, to reigns measured in decades. Human decades. The gods step back, human kings step forward, and the world described in the text becomes, from that point on, recognizably historical. The fringe interpretations of this withdrawal are, predictably, more dramatic. For those who follow Sitchin's framework, the departure of the Anunnaki was not metaphorical, but physical. The beings who had established civilization, intervened in human biology, and governed through intermediary kings eventually had reason to leave. Whether that reason was conflict among themselves, a catastrophic event on Earth, or simply the completion of whatever project had brought them here, Sitchin connected their departure to a series of ancient cataclysms, including what he interpreted as evidence of nuclear or high-energy weapons use in the region of the Sinai Peninsula and the Dead Sea, an area spanning parts of Egypt and what is now Palestine, pointing to scorched soil layers and the abrupt abandonment of cities in the 3rd millennium BC as physical traces of a catastrophic end to Anunnaki civilization on Earth. The geological and archaeological evidence for deliberate nuclear-scale destruction in that region is not accepted by mainstream science. The abandoned cities have conventional explanations: drought, invasion, political collapse. The scorched layers have terrestrial sources. These objections are serious and should be weighed seriously, and yet the abandonment of cities across the ancient Near East around 2200 BC is itself a genuine historical event. It is called the 4.2 kiloyear event, a period of severe, prolonged drought that collapsed not only Mesopotamian civilization, but the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the Indus Valley civilization, and several early Chinese dynastic cultures, more or less simultaneously. It is one of the most dramatic examples of coordinated civilizational collapse in the ancient record. Its cause was climatic, its scale was global, and it happened, with uncomfortable precision, right at the historical moment when the Sumerian texts begin to describe the withdrawal of the divine. There is another thread worth following, quieter and more philosophical in nature. Several ancient traditions, not only Sumerian but Egyptian, Vedic, and Mesoamerican, contain what scholars call a Golden Age narrative, a memory or a myth of a primordial time when divine beings walked among humans, when knowledge was given freely, when the distance between heaven and earth was, in some sense, navigable. And then, in every tradition, without exception, that age ends. The gods depart. The distance opens. Humanity is left with the memory of what was given and the responsibility of maintaining it without further instruction. The Greeks called it the Age of Gold, followed by silver, then bronze, then iron, each era a further step away from divine proximity, each generation a little more alone. The Hindus have the concept of the yugas, vast cycles of time in which consciousness and divine connection gradually diminish across epochs. The Hopi of North America speak of previous worlds, destroyed and remade, from which only fragments of original knowledge survived. These traditions did not communicate with each other. They arose independently, on separate continents, across thousands of years. And yet they tell, with remarkable structural consistency, the same story. Something was here. Something left. And what we have now, our civilizations, our knowledge, our religious systems, our persistent sense that we are reaching towards something we cannot quite name, is the inheritance of that departure. Whether that story is a universal feature of human psychology, a shared mythological response to the mystery of existence, or the echo of something that actually happened, that is a question none of the texts, taken alone, can answer. There is a final detail worth considering before moving on. In the ancient Sumerian city of Lagash, archaeologists found a series of inscriptions left by a ruler named Gudea, who governed around 2100 BC, right at the edge of the great civilizational collapse, right at the historical moment when the divine presence was beginning, by all textual accounts, to recede. Gudea's inscriptions describe a dream. In the dream, a divine figure, tall, radiant, flanked by lions, gives him detailed architectural instructions for building a new temple. Measurements, materials, orientation, specific ritual requirements. The figure does not explain itself. It does not linger. It gives the instructions, and it leaves. Gudea built the temple exactly as described. He recorded every detail of the dream with the care of a man who understood he had been given something he might not be given again. He was probably right. The temple he built was called Eninu, the House of 50, a name that connected it to the highest levels of Anunnaki authority. It was, in the understanding of the people who built it, a dwelling place, a prepared space, a house left ready for an occupant who might, if the conditions were right, return. As far as the historical record shows, the occupant never came, but the house was built, and the dream was written down, and the inscription has survived 4,000 years of flood and war and neglect and conquest to be read by scholars in the 21st century who are still, in their own way, asking the same question Gudea was asking when he pressed those words into clay in the dying light of the Sumerian world. Where did they go? And is there any possibility, however remote, however unverifiable, however uncomfortable it makes the frameworks we have built to explain ourselves, that the answer is somewhere we have not yet thought to look? Gudea's unanswered question hangs in the air like incense smoke in an empty temple, and it pulls us, almost by gravity, toward an event that sits at the very center of the Anunnaki story, an event so deeply embedded in human memory that it appears, in one form or another, in nearly every culture that has ever left a written record. The flood. Not a flood. The flood. A specific, catastrophic, world-altering event that the oldest texts describe not as natural disaster, but as decision. Not something that happened to humanity, but something that was done to it. And the Anunnaki, according to the people who first wrote it down, were the ones who made the choice. There is a museum in Istanbul, the Archaeological Museums of Istanbul, that holds, among its vast and undervisited collection, a fragment of clay tablet that most people walk past without a second glance. It is small. Its edges are broken. The cuneiform pressed into its surface is faded in places, sharp in others. But what is written on it is among the oldest narrative literature ever recovered from the ancient world. It is a piece of the Sumerian flood story, not the Babylonian version, not the version most people know from the Epic of Gilgamesh. An older one, a version written in a language that was already ancient when Babylon was young, describing events that the scribes who recorded it believed had taken place in a time before memory, before the flood that reset the world and made everything that came after possible. The hero of this version is named Ziusudra. He is a king. He is described as pious, attentive, devoted to the gods. And one day, according to the text, he receives a warning. The warning comes from Enki. The structure of the Sumerian flood narrative is, on its surface, familiar to anyone raised in a culture touched by the Hebrew Bible. A righteous man, a divine warning, a vessel built to survive catastrophic waters, a world destroyed and remade. The parallels are not coincidental. Scholars have traced the literary DNA from Sumer through Akkad through Babylon, watching the story evolve and travel across centuries and cultures, accumulating new details and shedding old ones like a river picking up sediment. But the Sumerian version contains elements that the later traditions quietly removed, elements that change the meaning of the story in ways that are worth examining carefully. In the Sumerian account, the flood is not a moral judgment. There is no catalog of human wickedness, no divine disappointment with the ethical state of civilization. The decision to send the flood is made by the Anunnaki collectively, specifically by Enlil, the chief authority among them. And the reason given is not sin. It is noise. The Atrahasis epic, the most complete version of this older narrative, is explicit on this point. Humanity had multiplied. The earth was, in the text's own language, bellowing like a bull. The noise of human civilization had become so great that Enlil could not sleep. The decision to reduce the human population was reached after a series of earlier attempts: plague, drought, famine, each of which Enki quietly undermined by warning humanity and helping them survive. The flood was the final solution, and this time Enlil made the other Anunnaki swear an oath of secrecy. No warning was to be given. Enki found a way around the oath. He could not warn Ziusudra directly. That would violate the agreement. So he spoke instead to the walls of a reed hut. He addressed the building, not the man inside it. And Ziusudra, listening on the other side of the wall, heard everything. It is a detail so specific, so legally precise, so oddly bureaucratic for a divine narrative, that it has fascinated scholars for generations. This is not the behavior of an omnipotent deity indifferent to procedural niceties. This is a being navigating a political constraint, finding a loophole, acting within the letter of an agreement while violating its spirit. It reads less like mythology and more like a record of an actual disagreement between actual decision-makers. Whether or not that impression is accurate, the Sumerians appear to have intended it precisely that way. The question of whether a global flood actually occurred is one of the most debated topics at the intersection of geology, archaeology, and ancient history. The scientific consensus is careful here. There is no credible geological evidence for a single worldwide flood event in the period that ancient texts describe, roughly 3000 to 5000 BC by most scholarly estimates. The Earth's stratigraphy does not support it. The physical mechanics of a planet-covering deluge of the scale described in the texts are, by current understanding, impossible. But that is not quite the same thing as saying nothing happened. What geologists have found and continue to find is evidence of a series of significant, regionally catastrophic flood events during precisely this period. The Black Sea, for instance, was once a freshwater lake. Around 5600 BC, by one influential theory proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman. The natural dam separating it from the Mediterranean collapsed. The resulting inflow of saltwater was, in their estimation, catastrophic. A deluge that flooded hundreds of miles of previously inhabited shoreline within a matter of months, possibly weeks. Settlements, farmland, entire communities swallowed. The people who lived there and survived would have experienced something that felt, from inside it, exactly like the end of the world. Ryan and Pittman's Black Sea hypothesis remains contested. Other researchers have challenged the scale of the event, the timeline, and the speed of the flooding. But the core geological fact, that the Black Sea's shoreline changed dramatically in this period, is not in dispute, and it is not the only candidate. The Persian Gulf, which sits at the geographic heart of Mesopotamian civilization, was not always a body of water. During the last ice age, it was a river valley, fertile, inhabited, threaded with waterways fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi Batin rivers. As global temperatures rose and ice sheets melted, sea levels climbed. The Gulf began to fill. The flooding was gradual by human standards, but relentless. A slow erasure of an entire inhabited landscape that would have unfolded over generations, leaving behind only memory and the stories memory becomes. Jeffrey Rose, an archaeologist who has studied the Persian Gulf extensively, has argued that this flooding may have displaced a significant population of people northward into Mesopotamia. People who arrived already carrying a sophisticated cultural tradition, appearing in the archaeological record with a suddenness that has puzzled researchers for decades. The so-called Ubaid culture, which forms the foundation of Sumerian civilization, appears in the archaeological record around 6500 BC with what some researchers consider an unusual degree of organizational complexity for its apparent stage of development. Where did that complexity come from? The debate is ongoing. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the version of the flood story most people encounter first, and it remains one of the most astonishing documents in the history of human literature. It was already ancient when the library copy found at Nineveh was made. That version dates to around 700 BC, but the story it preserves is far older, with roots extending back to at least 2100 BC, and possibly earlier still. In the Gilgamesh version, the flood survivor is named Utnapishtim. He is granted immortality after the flood and relocated to a place the text calls the mouth of the rivers, a location at the edge of the world, permanent, unreachable by ordinary human means. Gilgamesh, the hero of the larger epic, seeks him out because Utnapishtim is the only human being who has ever been given eternal life, and Gilgamesh wants to know how to obtain it for himself. What Utnapishtim tells him is essentially this: "What happened to me will not happen to you. The gods made an exception once. They will not make it again." It is a melancholy answer, and it contains, embedded within it, an implication that goes largely unremarked in popular discussions of the text. The implication is that the relationship between humanity and the Anunnaki, after the flood, is fundamentally different from what it was before. Before, there was proximity, intervention, direct contact. After, there is distance, exception, the sense that a door has been closed that will not easily reopen. The flood in this reading is not just a physical event. It is a boundary, a line in the story of the world on one side of which things were one way, and on the other side of which they are another way entirely. There is a site in the mountains of eastern Turkey, the region the ancients called Urartu, what is now the area around Lake Van, where local tradition has insisted for centuries that the remains of a great vessel lie somewhere on the upper slopes. The connection to the biblical and pre-biblical flood narratives is obvious, and has generated endless speculation, most of it more enthusiastic than rigorous. What is less frequently discussed is what the surrounding landscape tells a geologist. The entire region shows clear evidence of massive ancient flooding: water-carved valleys, displaced sediment, shoreline markers at elevations that make no sense in the context of the current hydrology. Something moved an extraordinary amount of water through this landscape at some point in the deep past. When exactly and from what source remains a matter of ongoing scientific discussion. The mountains also sit at the intersection of three major tectonic plates. The geology here is violent, ancient, and still active. If you were designing a landscape that could plausibly have experienced catastrophic flooding events in the period that ancient texts describe, you would be hard-pressed to design one more convincing than this. Among the most intriguing elements of the flood tradition is what survives it. In every version of the story, Sumerian, Babylonian, Hebrew, and the dozens of parallel traditions found from Greece to India to the indigenous cultures of the Americas, the survivor is not merely saved. He is given something: knowledge, instruction, seed, the raw material of civilization, preserved through the catastrophe and replanted on the other side. Ziusudra, after the flood, is granted eternal life and relocated to a paradise called Dilmun. Utnapishtim receives the same gift at the mouth of the rivers. Noah, in the Hebrew tradition, receives a covenant, a formal agreement, a set of terms, a new framework for the relationship between humanity and the divine. In the Hindu tradition, the flood survivor Manu receives the Vedas, the foundational texts of an entire civilizational tradition, preserved through the waters and handed back to humanity when the world is dry again. In every case, the message is the same. What matters is not the destruction. What matters is what is carried through it, which raises a question that no flood narrative, ancient or modern, has ever fully answered. Who decided what was worth saving? In the Sumerian texts, it is Enki who makes that determination. Enki who chooses Ziusudra. Enki who provides the instructions, the warning, the means of survival. The same Enki who created humanity in the first place. The same Enki who, throughout the mythological record, consistently positions himself as the protector of the human race against the harsher judgments of his fellow Anunnaki. Whether Enki is a god, a memory, an archetype, or something else entirely, his consistency across thousands of years of independent textual tradition is remarkable. He is always on the side of survival, always the one who finds the loophole, always the one who ensures that something of humanity makes it through to the other side. And if the flood was real, in whatever form and on whatever scale, then something did make it through. We are the evidence of that. We are here, asking the question, which means the answer to who survived is, at minimum, us. But the older question, the one the Sumerian scribes were asking when they first pressed the story into clay, is not who survived the flood. It is who made sure that we would. Someone made sure we would survive. And according to the oldest records humanity has ever produced, the world those survivors inherited was not the first world. It was a reconstruction, a second attempt, a civilization rebuilt on the foundations of something that came before. Something older, grander, and in certain respects more extraordinary than anything that followed. The people who built that first world had names. The Sumerians remembered them, and they wrote them down. In the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, a building that has itself survived invasions, lootings, and the particular violence that history reserves for places that hold too much memory, there is a collection of cuneiform tablets and prisms that represent one of the most quietly remarkable documents in the entire archaeological record. The most famous surviving copy of this document was found at Larsa, an ancient Sumerian city southeast of Babylon, and dates to around 1800 BC. But the tradition it preserves is far older. Scholars believe the original composition reaches back to at least 2100 BC, and the information it contains may have been transmitted orally or in earlier written forms for centuries before that. It is called the Sumerian King List. On the surface, it is an administrative document, a record of rulers, their cities, and the lengths of their reigns, organized into dynasties and presented in sequential order. The Sumerians produced many such records. They were meticulous administrators, people who understood that power required documentation. In its later sections, the King List is an invaluable historical source. Names that appear on it have been confirmed by independent inscriptions, by trade records, by correspondence found hundreds of miles from the original sites. It is, for the period it covers reliably, a genuine chronicle. But its opening section is something else entirely. Before the flood, it says, kingship descended from heaven, and then it names the kings, 8 rulers, 5 cities, and reigns that stretch across a span of time so vast that the mind resists processing it. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years. Alalgar, also of Eridu, for 36,000. Enmenluana of Bad Tabira for 43,200. Enmengalana, also of Bad Tabira, for 28,800. The divine Dumuzi, a shepherd king of Bad Tabira, for 36,000. Ensapad Zid Ana of Larik for 28,800. Enmendur Ana of Sipar for 21,000. And finally, Ubaratutu of Shurupak, the father, in most versions of the flood narrative, of the man who would survive the deluge, for 18,600 years. 8 kings, a combined reign, if taken at face value, of approximately 241 Dwazon 200 years. Then the flood swept over the earth, and the numbers changed completely. The kings who follow the flood, the post-diluvian rulers, reign for centuries at first, then decades, then years, then terms that look increasingly like ordinary human lifespans. The numbers contract across the generations with a consistency that feels almost mathematical, as if the document is tracking not just political succession but a measurable decline in something. Longevity, divine proximity, the concentration of some quality that was abundant before the flood and scarcer afterward. Whatever that quality was, the Sumerians clearly believed it had once existed in extraordinary measure. Mainstream scholarship approaches the antediluvian reign lengths with a mixture of scholarly caution and genuine curiosity. The dominant interpretation is that the numbers are symbolic, that the Sumerians used specific numerical systems, particularly those based on the SAR unit of 3,600, to convey concepts of divine legitimacy and temporal authority rather than literal chronology. In this reading, a king who reigned for 36,000 years was not actually that old. He was simply being described as possessing authority so complete, so divinely sanctioned, so far beyond ordinary human scale that only an extraordinary number could do it justice. This interpretation is linguistically grounded. Sumerian mathematics was sophisticated and symbolically rich. The number 3,600 held particular significance. It was the SAR, the Great Year, a unit that appears throughout Mesopotamian astronomical and administrative records. Numbers built from multiples of 3,600 carried connotations of completeness, of cosmic order, of things that operated on a scale beyond the human. It is a persuasive reading, and it may be entirely correct. But there is a complication. Several, in fact. The first is that the king list does not present its antediluvian reigns as symbolic in any way that distinguishes them from its historical reigns. The document makes no internal distinction between the 8 pre-flood kings and the rulers who follow them. It uses the same format, the same language, the same organizational structure throughout. If the early numbers are symbolic and the later numbers are literal, the document itself gives no signal that this transition occurs. The second complication is more unsettling. Several of the antediluvian kings named in the list appear in other Sumerian texts, not as mythological figures, but as historical reference points. Enmendurana of Sipar, the 7th pre-flood king, appears in a separate tradition as the founder of the art of divination, the reading of omens, the interpretation of celestial signs. He is described as having been taken up into the assembly of the gods, taught the secrets of heaven and earth, and returned to humanity as a transmitter of divine knowledge. He is, in some scholarly analyses, a Sumerian precursor to the biblical Enoch, the man who walked with God and was taken. The parallels between Enmendur-Ana and Enoch are specific enough that they have generated serious academic attention. Both are associated with the 7th position in their respective lineages. Both are connected to astronomical knowledge. Both are described as having received divine instruction directly. Both disappear from the narrative in ways that suggest translation rather than death. Whether this parallel represents cultural borrowing, independent parallel development, or the preservation of a shared historical memory is a question scholars continue to debate. The cities named in the Antediluvian section of the King list are not mythological locations. They are real places. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sipar, Shuruppak. All of them have been located archaeologically. All of them show occupation layers that reach back to the deepest strata of Mesopotamian habitation. Shuruppak in particular, the city of the flood hero's father, has been excavated extensively. Its ruins sit at a site now called Tel Farah in southern Iraq, and its archaeological record contains something that has interested researchers since it was first properly examined in the early 20th century. A flood layer. Not a metaphorical flood. A physical stratum of water-laid sediment deposited by an actual inundation, separating the archaeological layers below it from those above. Leonard Woolley found a similar layer at during his excavations in the 1920s, 8 feet of clean, water-deposited silt, containing no artifacts, separating 2 distinct occupation periods. He initially believed he had found physical evidence of the biblical flood and announced as much to considerable public excitement. The excitement proved premature. Subsequent analysis showed that the flood layers at different sites were not contemporaneous. They came from different periods, suggesting local or regional flooding events rather than a single global catastrophe. The scientific interpretation, as noted, does not support a worldwide deluge, but the layers are real. The flooding happened multiple times in multiple locations, with enough force to deposit significant sediment and interrupt the continuity of occupation at some of the oldest cities in the world. Something was being recorded, even if the scale was different from what the texts describe. Among the more persistent fringe interpretations of the Antediluvian King tradition is the argument that the extraordinary reign lengths are not symbolic and not literal in a chronological sense, but biological. That the beings described as ruling for tens of thousands of years were not humans as we understand the term, that they possessed, whether through genetics, technology, or some other mechanism, lifespans that made ordinary human longevity look like an afternoon. This reading draws support in the minds of its proponents from the consistent pattern of decline across the King list. If the numbers represented pure symbolism, why would they decrease so systematically after the flood? Symbolic numbers tend to be stable or variable for rhetorical purposes, not subject to a clear directional trend. The progressive contraction of reign lengths, generation by generation, has a biological feel to it. It looks less like a changing literary convention and more like a half-life curve, something diminishing over time at a measurable rate. What that something might have been: genetic heritage from a longer-lived ancestral population, access to knowledge or technology that extended life, proximity to environmental conditions that no longer exist. The texts do not specify. They simply record the numbers, generation by generation, and let the pattern speak for itself. There is one antediluvian king who deserves particular attention. Not for the length of his reign, which at 21,000 years is modest by the standards of his predecessors, but for what the texts say about what happened to him. Enmendur-Ana of Sipar. Sipar was one of the great cult centers of ancient Mesopotamia, the city of Shamash, the sun god, the divine embodiment of justice and truth. It sat on the Euphrates north of Babylon and was considered, in the Mesopotamian theological tradition, a city of particular sacred significance. Its temple, the Ababar, was one of the most venerated shrines in the ancient world, continuously maintained and restored across thousands of years of Mesopotamian history. Enmendur-Ana, according to the tradition associated with him, was brought into the presence of the Anunnaki, specifically of Anu and Enlil, and taught 2 things. The first was the inspection of oil on water, a divinatory practice that remained in continuous use in Mesopotamian culture for thousands of years afterward. The second was the reading of celestial tablets, astronomical observations systematized into a method of understanding the future through the movements of heavenly bodies. He was then sent back. a mortal, returned from divine company, carrying knowledge that had not previously existed among human beings, commissioned to establish a hereditary line of practitioners who would preserve and transmit what he had learned. The text that describes this is known as the Diviner's Manual, and it is not presented as a myth. It is presented as a professional origin document, a record of where the knowledge came from and how it was authorized. The descendants of Enmendur-Ana, the text implies, derive their legitimacy not from political succession, but from this original act of divine instruction. Knowledge, in other words, was not discovered by humanity. It was given by specific beings, at a specific moment, to a specific individual who was then charged with passing it on. Whether or not that account is historically accurate, it tells us something important about how the ancient Sumerians understood the relationship between human knowledge and divine source. They did not believe they had figured things out on their own. They believed they had been taught, and the teacher, in their account, had a name, a city, and a position in a hierarchy that extended far above the human world. The Antediluvian Kings are, depending on your perspective, one of three things. They are literary constructions, symbolic figures invented to give Sumerian kingship a divine genealogy that reached back before history into sacred time. They are distorted memories, real figures, real dynasties, real periods of human civilization so remote that their actual histories have been compressed, inflated, and mythologized beyond recognition by centuries of oral transmission. Or they are something the Sumerians claim they were, a record, however imperfect, of a time when the world was governed differently by beings whose nature and origins we have not yet found a satisfactory way to categorize. None of these possibilities can be proven. None of them can be entirely dismissed. What can be said with complete confidence is that the people who wrote the king list believed they were recording something true. That the 8 kings who ruled before the flood were not invented for rhetorical effect but remembered, preserved through the catastrophe, carried across the water, written down so that what came before would not be entirely lost to what came after. Someone thought those names were worth saving. And the question that the king list leaves unanswered, the question that its careful cuneiform columns seem to whisper across 4,000 years of silence, is not whether the Antediluvian kings existed. It is what they knew, what they carried, what was lost when the flood came, and whether any of it, in some form we have not yet learned to recognize, survived. What was lost when the flood came? It is a question that pulls at something deep, not just intellectually, but in a way that feels almost instinctive, as if the asking of it touches something older than language, and it leads, almost inevitably, to a single figure. The one who stood between the decision to destroy and the impulse to preserve. The one who found the loophole. The one who, across thousands of years of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian literature, appears again and again in the same role. Keeper, teacher, protector, and the custodian of something the texts call, in their most direct moments, the knowledge of everything. His name was Enki, and what he knew, or what the ancient scribes believed he knew, is a mystery that has not yet been fully unwrapped. In the southern Iraqi desert, not far from the ancient coastline of a Persian Gulf that was once considerably larger than it is today, the ruins of Eridu sit beneath a sky that seems, in certain lights, almost prehistoric in its clarity. The city is old enough that standing at its edge feels less like visiting a historical site and more like standing at the beginning of something. The air is dry. The ground is pale. The silence has the quality of depth rather than emptiness, as though the quiet here is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has outlasted it. Eridu was Enki's city. His temple here, called the Abzu, named after the primordial underground freshwater ocean he was said to inhabit and govern, was the first temple ever built in the world's first city. When archaeologists reached the lowest excavation levels at Eridu in the 1940s, they found not one temple but 18, each built directly on the foundations of the one before it. 18 successive sacred structures, each generation of worshippers building on what the previous generation had left, stretching back in an unbroken religious continuity to a period so remote that the pottery found at the lowest levels belongs to a type found nowhere else on Earth. 18 temples, all of them Enkis, all of them built over the same sacred ground. Whatever was being honored here, people kept coming back to honor it. For thousands of years, without interruption, they returned to this specific place and built again. To understand Enki's knowledge, you first have to understand what the Sumerians meant when they used the word me. It is one of the most discussed and least fully translated concepts in all of Sumerian literature. Scholars have rendered it variously as divine laws, civilizational powers, sacred offices, or the fundamental ordering principles of existence. None of these translations is entirely wrong. None is entirely adequate. The me were, in the Sumerian understanding, not abstract concepts but actual objects, things that could be held, carried, stolen, transferred. Things with weight and presence, the tangible embodiment of every institution, skill, and form of knowledge that made civilization possible. The list of me preserved in a text known as the Descent of Inanna and related compositions is extraordinary in its scope. It includes kingship and priesthood, truth and descent into the underworld. The scribal arts and music, metalworking and leatherworking, the craft of the builder and the skill of the midwife, wisdom, understanding, and the art of lamentation, sexual love and prostitution, the kindling of fire and the extinguishing of fire, the standard, the quiver, the sword, and the shield, insight, judgment, and the craft of decision-making, the ability to descend to the underworld and return. This is not a random collection. It is a comprehensive inventory. Everything required to build and maintain a complex society, cataloged and attributed not to human ingenuity, but to a divine source that had created, organized, and distributed these capacities deliberately. And all of it, every me, every civilizational power, was kept in Enki's temple, in the Abzu at Eridu, under his direct custody and control. He was not just a god of water. He was the librarian of everything that mattered. The Sumerian text known as Enki and Inanna, sometimes called the Descent of the Me, describes what happens when Inanna, the goddess of love and war and one of the most powerful figures in the Mesopotamian pantheon, decides she wants the Me for herself. She travels to Eridu. She meets Enki. He receives her with hospitality, with feasting, with the kind of generous welcome that the texts describe in luxurious detail. And then, in what scholars delicately call a moment of divine indiscretion, Enki begins presenting her with the Me one by one. He gives her kingship. He gives her godship. He gives her the descent to the underworld and the ascent from it. He gives her the scribal arts, the craft of the smith, the art of music. He gives and gives and gives across a list that in some translations runs to over 100 discrete items. Then he sobers up and realizes what he has done. He sends his messenger to recover the Me before Inanna can reach her home city of Uruk. The attempt fails. Inanna arrives safely, the Me intact, and Eridu's monopoly on the ordering principles of civilization is broken. From that point forward, the knowledge that had been centralized in Enki's keeping begins to disperse. It is, on one level, a literary explanation for how different cities and different institutions came to possess different forms of expertise and authority. On another level, it is a story about the vulnerability of knowledge, about how easily something carefully kept can be given away, dispersed, diluted, about how the concentrated wisdom of a single source can be scattered by a single moment of inattention. And on a third level, it raises a question that the text does not answer. If Enki held all of this knowledge, if he was its original custodian, its keeper, and its source, where did he get it? The Sumerian texts are consistent on this point, even when they are vague on the details. Enki's knowledge was not learned. It was not accumulated over time through experience and observation, the way human knowledge is built. It was inherent, original. The texts describe him as knowing the secrets of the deep, not metaphorically, but literally, as if the primordial underground ocean he inhabited was itself a repository of information, a medium through which certain truths were accessible that were not accessible from the surface world. His epithets in the texts are telling. He is called the Knowing One, the Wise One, the one whose mouth brings forth understanding. He is described as the God who knows the fate of all things, not as a prophet, but as someone who understands mechanism, who sees the structure beneath the surface of events, who knows how things work at a level that others do not have access to. He is, in modern terms, an engineer, a scientist, a being whose relationship to knowledge is technical rather than purely mystical. Someone who doesn't just know that things are a certain way, but understands why they are that way and how they could be made to be otherwise. This is, when you sit with it, a very unusual quality for a deity to possess. Most ancient gods embody forces. They are the storm, the harvest, the plague, the sun. Enki is none of these things. He is the one who understands the forces, who can work with them, redirect them, find the point at which intervention is possible. He is the one who created humanity, in the Sumerian account, not by divine fiat, by simple command, but by a technical process, by mixing, by combining, by working with existing biological material and producing something new. There is a Sumerian text known as Enki and the World Order that deserves to be far better known outside of specialist academic circles. In it, Enki travels through the world, across the rivers, the seas, the marshes, the agricultural lands, and assigns to each element of the natural and human world its proper function, its proper keeper, its proper place in the ordered system of existence. He does not create these things. He organizes them. He establishes who is responsible for what, which divine being governs which domain, what the rules are for each aspect of the world's functioning. It reads, in certain passages, less like mythology and more like the documentation of an administrative system being established for the first time, a governance framework being written, a set of protocols being distributed to the relevant parties. And at the end of the text, Enki makes a statement that scholars have returned to repeatedly because it is so much more absolute than anything a symbolic deity figure would need to say. He declares that he knows the fate that Enlil, the chief authority among the Anunnaki, has decreed for every city, every land, every institution. That nothing in the ordered world is hidden from him. That his knowledge encompasses everything that has been decided about the shape of the world and the future of humanity. He is not claiming to be all-powerful. He is claiming to be completely informed. The distinction matters. He is not saying he controls everything. He is saying he knows everything, that he has access to information that others do not, including, the implication runs, information about what has been planned and what is to come. In the flood narrative, this is exactly what saves humanity. Not divine power, not miraculous intervention, information. A warning passed through a wall by a being who knew what was coming and chose, in violation of the spirit of an agreement he had sworn, to share that knowledge rather than withhold it. Knowledge, in Enki's story, is consistently the decisive factor, the thing that makes the difference between survival and annihilation, between civilization and chaos, between the continuation of the human project and its termination. The fringe interpretations of Enki's knowledge are, predictably, more literal in their claims and more difficult to evaluate. For those who follow the ancient astronaut framework, Enki's expertise, his technical knowledge of biology, his understanding of celestial mechanics, his apparent grasp of long-term historical trajectories, points toward a being whose knowledge was not mystical, but scientific. A being from an advanced civilization who possessed, in functional terms, what we would today call technological capability. His role in the creation of humanity in this reading was genetic engineering. His role as keeper of the Emmy was the administration of a civilizational program, a deliberate project to develop human society along specific lines using knowledge imported from elsewhere. The Abzu, Enki's underground domain, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, has attracted particular attention from researchers who approach these texts from an alternative perspective. Some have argued that the Abzu was not metaphorical at all, but a physical installation, a structure built underground near the water table of ancient Eridu that housed equipment, records, or materials whose nature the Sumerian scribes could only describe in the language available to them, the language of the sacred and the divine. This interpretation is speculative. The archaeological record at Eridu, thorough as it is, has not produced evidence of anything that could not be explained by conventional temple-building practices. But it is worth noting that the water table in the region of ancient Eridu was, and remains, unusually high. The city was built at the edge of a freshwater marsh, in a landscape dominated by salt flats and desert. The presence of fresh water in that environment would have been, to the people who found it, genuinely extraordinary. A literal manifestation of the Abzu, the underground ocean, breaking through to the surface at this specific, singular point. Sacred sites in almost every tradition tend to cluster around genuinely unusual natural phenomena. Eridu's freshwater anomaly may have been the original reason the site was chosen, and what was built on top of that anomaly, 18 successive temples, the oldest religious architecture on Earth, the house of the god of knowledge, grew from that original, real, physical marvel. What the people who came to that water believed they were touching when they touched it. That is a question that recedes into a past too deep to see clearly. There is one more dimension of Enki's knowledge that deserves careful attention, because it appears in a context that is both very specific and very strange. In a text known as the Kesh Temple Hymn, one of the oldest literary compositions ever found, dated in some analyses to before 2500 BC, there is a passage that describes a form of knowledge so fundamental that the text calls it the knowledge of the shape of the earth and the decrees of the gods assembled before the world was made. This knowledge, the text implies, existed before the current order of things, before the cities, before the flood, before the institution of kingship. Enki is its keeper, not because he acquired it, but because he was there when it was established, because he was present at the original assembly, the gathering of divine beings at which the fundamental parameters of the world were set. And he remembers what was decided. He is, in this reading, not just the God of wisdom in the present tense. He is the living archive of a past that predates everything human civilization can access. His knowledge is not stored in tablets or temples, though it may be reflected there. It is stored in him, in the continuity of his existence across a time span that the Sumerian text suggests stretches back further than any human institution, any human memory, any human attempt at record-keeping. He was there before the flood. He was there before the cities. He was there, according to some readings of the cosmological texts, before the current configuration of the world itself. What a being who has witnessed that much might know about origins, about purpose, about the long arc of what humanity is and where it is going, is something the texts gesture at without ever fully stating. The Sumerians seem to have understood on some level that the full content of Enki's knowledge was not something that could be written down, not because it was mystical in an evasive sense, but because it was simply too large, too old, too comprehensive for the clay tablet format, or perhaps for any format available to human hands. What they could do, and what they did with extraordinary care and persistence, was record the edges of it, the moments when it touched the human world, the instances when a piece of it was given, to Zusudra, through a wall, to Enmendurana, in the assembly of the gods, to the craftsmen and scribes and diviners who carried specific me out of Eridu and into the cities of the world. They recorded what was given, and they noted, without apparent distress but with unmistakable awareness, that what was given was always partial, always a fragment of something larger, always a piece of a whole that remained in Enki's keeping, in the deep water beneath the first city, in the silence of the Abzu, where the fresh water rose from somewhere below the surface of the known world. There is a hymn to Enki, preserved in the cuneiform collections of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, that ends with a passage researchers have found difficult to translate with full confidence. Not because the language is unclear, but because what it appears to say is so much larger than a hymn seems designed to contain. The passage describes Enki looking out from the Abzu. Looking, the text says, at the totality of the lands, at the shape of what exists, and it describes him as knowing, in the moment of that looking, the fate of everything he sees, not as prophecy, not as vision, but as simple, clear, direct knowledge, the way you know the layout of a room you have lived in for years. He looks at the world, and he knows it completely. What he does with that knowledge, whether he shares it or keeps it, whether it has been dispersed across the fragments of clay that survive in museum collections around the world, or whether the core of it remains somewhere inaccessible to us, is a question the hymn does not answer. It simply ends. The way deep water ends, not with a wall or a floor you can find, but with a gradual darkening, a pressure that increases the further down you go, and the slow, certain understanding that you have reached the limit of how far an ordinary human being can descend. Whatever Enki knew, we are still, in our way, diving for it. And the question that waits at the bottom of that dive, patient, ancient, undisturbed by the centuries of searching above it, is whether the knowledge was ever truly lost, or whether it is simply waiting in the deep water for someone who knows how to ask for it correctly. Perhaps the knowledge is not waiting in the water at all. Perhaps it was written down, not on clay tablets pressed by human hands in the lamplight of a Sumerian scribal school, not in the cuneiform columns that archaeologists brush carefully from the soil of southern Iraq and carry, fragment by fragment, into museum storage rooms where they wait decades for a scholar with the right combination of expertise and patience to read them. Something older than that. Something that the Sumerian scribes themselves described with a reverence that set it apart from every other object in their entire cosmological tradition. They called them the Tablets of Destiny. And from the moment they appear in the textual record, they carry a weight that no other object in the ancient world quite matches. In the British Museum, in a gallery that most visitors pass through on their way to something more famous, there is a large stone relief from the ancient Assyrian palace of Nineveh. It dates to around 700 BC and depicts, among its registers of divine figures and mythological scenes, a winged being whose chest bears what the accompanying cuneiform inscription identifies as the Tablets of Destiny. The being is not human. Its posture is formal, ceremonial, the posture of someone carrying something whose importance exceeds their own. The relief is beautiful. It is also, in a way that is easy to miss if you walk past it quickly, deeply strange. Because the Tablets of Destiny it depicts are not depicted as books, or scrolls, or any form of record-keeping that looks familiar to a modern eye. They are shown as a flat object worn against the body, held close, kept on the person of whoever possesses them, the way you might keep something whose value was so absolute that letting it out of physical contact felt like an unacceptable risk. Whoever held the Tablets of Destiny held something worth protecting with your body. The question is what, exactly, they contained. The Tablets of Destiny. In Sumerian, the Dup Shamadi. In Akkadian, the Tupi Shamadi, appear across a remarkable range of Mesopotamian texts spanning more than 2,000 years of literary tradition. They are not a minor detail. They are not a peripheral element of one specific myth. They are a recurring, central, load-bearing feature of the Mesopotamian understanding of how the world works and who controls it. Their function, in the broadest terms, is this. Whoever possesses the Tablets of Destiny possesses authority over the fates of gods and men. The tablets are not merely a record of what is destined to happen. They are the mechanism by which destiny is determined and enforced. Possession of them confers the right, and the power, to decree what the future will be. This is a theological concept of extraordinary ambition. It means that destiny, in the Mesopotamian understanding, is not a fixed metaphysical property of the universe. It is something written, something that can be held, something that can be taken, transferred, stolen, won, and lost. And the history of the tablets of destiny in Mesopotamian literature is, in large part, a history of exactly those transactions. The most detailed account of the tablets of destiny appears in a text known as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, whose name means simply "when on high," taken from its opening words. It is one of the foundational texts of Mesopotamian civilization, composed in its surviving form sometime around 1100 BC, though drawing on much older Sumerian traditions. It was recited publicly at the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, every year. A ritual repetition of the creation story that the Babylonians believed was not merely commemorative, but functionally necessary. The world, in their understanding, had to be recreated each year through the act of telling how it had first been made. The Enuma Elish opens in a time before the world as we know it existed, before the sky had been named, before the earth had been given a title, before even the gods had fully taken their individual forms. There is only Apsu, the primordial fresh water, and Tiamat, the primordial salt water, mingling together in an undifferentiated mass at the beginning of everything. From this mingling, the first gods emerge, and from those gods, others. And eventually, the noise and activity of the younger gods disturbs the primordial parents, and a conflict begins that escalates over the course of the epic's 7 tablets into a full cosmological war. At the center of that war are the tablets of destiny. They are first held by Kingu, a being Tiamat elevates to lead her armies, to whom she grants the tablets as a symbol and instrument of supreme authority. She hangs them on his chest. She declares that his word will be supreme, that whatever he decrees will stand. The young god Marduk defeats Kingu, takes the tablets from him, and seals them with his own seal. From that moment, Marduk's authority over the cosmos is absolute. Not because he is the strongest or the oldest or the most inherently powerful, but because he holds the tablets, because he has, through combat and victory, acquired the mechanism of destiny itself. The world is then created, from Tiamat's defeated body, split in two, her upper half becoming the sky, and her lower half the earth. Human beings are made from Kingu's blood, mixed with clay. And the tablets of destiny rest in Marduk's keeping, the foundation of a cosmic order maintained by the fact of their possession. It is a creation story, but it is also, unmistakably, a political document. It is the theological justification for a specific form of authority, the claim that legitimate power flows not from lineage or strength alone, but from the possession of something that confers the right to determine outcomes. The tablets of destiny are, in this reading, a constitutional document, the source of sovereignty itself. But the Enuma Elish is not where the tablets of destiny first appear in Mesopotamian tradition. An older text, significantly older, contains a different account of the tablets and their custody that raises questions the Babylonian creation epic does not address. The text is known as the Myth of Anzu. Its main surviving versions date to around 1400 to 1000 BC, but the story it tells is believed to reach back into much earlier Sumerian tradition. And what it describes is not the primordial possession of the tablets by chaos forces, but their theft, from a specific location, by a specific being, with consequences that ripple through the divine order in ways that take the combined efforts of the greatest gods to resolve. Anzu, sometimes written Zu, is described as a divine bird of enormous size, a being whose body combined the features of a lion and an eagle, whose roar was the sound of a storm, whose wingspan darkened the sky. He is not a minor figure. He is granted a position of trust in the divine household, specifically the role of guardian at the entrance to the chamber where Enlil, the chief authority among the Anunnaki, bathes each morning. And every morning before Enlil enters the bath, he removes the tablets of destiny and sets them aside. Anzu watches this routine. He studies it. He waits. And then, one morning, he acts. He seizes the tablets of destiny. He takes them from their resting place, spreads his wings, and disappears into the mountains. And the moment he does, everything changes. The text describes the consequences with stark clarity. The moment the tablets leave Enlil's possession, his authority collapses. The rituals stop. The divine offices cease to function. The ordered running of the cosmos, which had depended apparently on the continuous custody of the tablets, simply stops. A paralysis descends on the divine world that nothing can break until the tablets are recovered. The tablets are not just a symbol of authority. They are its operating mechanism. Without them, the system does not run. The recovery of the tablets, eventually achieved by the hero god Ninurta after other divine champions decline the mission, restores order. But the myth of Anzu leaves behind several questions that the narrative does not bother to answer, perhaps because the people who first told it considered them already understood. How did the tablets work? What was the mechanism by which their possession conferred and sustained cosmic authority? Were they literally inscribed with the fates of all beings? And if so, in what language? Who wrote on them originally, and when, and from what knowledge, and why? If they were so fundamental to the functioning of the divine order, were they kept in a place accessible enough for a sufficiently motivated being to simply pick them up and fly away? These questions hover over every appearance of the tablets in Mesopotamian literature, and they are never directly answered. The texts assume a shared understanding that, from our position thousands of years later, we can only partially reconstruct. What we can say is that the tablets, as described across multiple independent textual traditions, possessed several consistent properties. They were physical objects, not abstract concepts. They were inscribed. Something was written on them, though what exactly is never quoted or summarized in any surviving text. Their possession was the decisive factor in determining who held ultimate authority. And they were, despite their cosmic importance, vulnerable, capable of being taken, lost, and recovered in ways that made the stability of the entire divine order contingent on their physical custody. A theological concept this specific, this consistent, and this materially grounded does not usually arise from pure imagination. It tends to arise from something real, from a physical object, an institution, a tradition that the symbolic language of myth is encoding rather than inventing. What that reality might have been is a question worth sitting with. Among mainstream scholars, the Tablets of Destiny are most commonly interpreted as a literary device encoding the Mesopotamian theological understanding of the relationship between cosmic order and divine authority. In this reading, the tablets represent the concept of divine decree, the idea that the universe operates according to principles established and maintained by a supreme divine authority, and that legitimate rulership derives from alignment with those principles rather than from raw power alone. This interpretation is coherent and well supported by the broader context of Mesopotamian theology. The texts consistently connect the tablets to concepts of law, order, and the proper functioning of the cosmos. The anxiety that their theft produces, the paralysis of divine functions, the collapse of cosmic routine, reflects a deep Mesopotamian concern with the maintenance of order against the constant threat of chaos. Tiamat, Anzu, the forces that periodically seize the tablets, they all represent the same fundamental threat: the disruption of the ordered system that makes existence livable. In this reading, the tablets are a theological proposition. They are the Mesopotamian answer to the question of where legitimacy comes from. But there is another layer to the tablets that the purely theological interpretation does not fully account for, and it emerges most clearly not in the great mythological epics, but in a smaller, more technical class of texts, the divinatory and astronomical literature that represents some of the most sophisticated intellectual production of ancient Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian divinatory tradition, the reading of celestial omens, the interpretation of liver shapes, the observation of atmospheric phenomena, was not, in the understanding of its practitioners, a system of prediction in the modern sense. It was not an attempt to guess the future through pattern recognition or probability. It was something more specific than that. It was a reading, a decipherment. The practitioners of Mesopotamian divination believed that the future had been written, inscribed, at the moment of creation, into the fabric of the observable world, and that trained attention to the right phenomena could reveal what had been written there. The sky was a text. The entrails of sacrificial animals were a text. The behavior of oil on water, the movement of smoke, the patterns of bird flight, all of these were texts inscribed by divine hands at the foundation of the world, waiting to be read by those with the knowledge to read them. The source of that inscription in the divinatory literature is consistently identified as the tablets of destiny. What the diviner reads in the sky or the liver is a reflection, an earthly echo, of what was written on the tablets at the beginning of time. The tablets are the original. The observable world is the copy. This means that the tablets of destiny, in the full context of Mesopotamian intellectual tradition, are not just a theological concept. They are an epistemological one. They are the claim that reality itself has a written structure, that existence is not random or mechanical, but inscribed, authored, accessible in principle to anyone who learns the language in which it was written. The me that Enki kept in the Abzu, those civilizational powers, those ordering principles, were in this framework themselves a kind of transcript of the tablets. Not the tablets themselves, but derivatives, applications, the practical implementation of principles that had their ultimate source in that original inscription, which returns us, with a precision that feels less like coincidence and more like architecture, to Enki himself. Because in the divinatory literature, in the technical, professional, carefully maintained tradition of Mesopotamian celestial observation, Enki is consistently identified as the being who taught humanity how to read. Not in the simple sense of literacy, though he is associated with that too, but in this deeper sense. He is the one who explained to human beings that the world was a text, who taught them that the patterns they observed were not random but inscribed, who gave them, through figures like Enmendur Anna of Sipar, the beginning of the knowledge of how to decipher what had been written. He did not give them the tablets of destiny. He gave them the reading primer. The fringe interpretations of the tablets of destiny are, in this case, unusually diverse, ranging from the relatively conservative to the genuinely extraordinary. On the more conservative end, some researchers have argued that the tablets represent a real physical archive, a collection of astronomical, mathematical, and historical records kept at a specific location in ancient Mesopotamia, whose loss or destruction at some point in history was so catastrophic to the intellectual tradition that it was encoded in mythological terms as the theft of cosmic destiny itself. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the largest known collection of cuneiform texts from the ancient world, destroyed in 612 BC when Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, has been proposed as one candidate for what the tablets mythologically represent. The destruction of that library, which contained the most complete versions of the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the divinatory literature, was genuinely catastrophic for the transmission of Mesopotamian knowledge. But the tablets appear in texts that predate the Nineveh library by more than 1,000 years. Whatever they represent, the myth is older than that specific loss. More speculative interpretations have proposed that the tablets of destiny were a form of advanced technology, a storage medium of some kind, capable of holding information in a form that conferred practical power over natural processes. The language used to describe their function, the way their possession stops and starts the functioning of cosmic systems, the way their theft paralyzes not just symbolic authority, but actual divine operations, has led some researchers to suggest that what the Sumerian scribes were describing in the only vocabulary available to them was something closer to a control system than a sacred text, a device whose possession determined who had access to the operating parameters of something larger, something that ran the world, or at least a significant portion of it, in ways that the people who wrote about it could observe but not fully explain. This interpretation has no archaeological support. It is, by the standards of mainstream scholarship, firmly in the territory of speculation. But the consistency with which the tablets are described as functionally, not just symbolically, essential to the operation of the divine order is a textual fact that the speculative interpretation is, at minimum, attempting to account for. There is one final thread that runs through the tablet tradition and deserves to be followed to its end, however inconclusive that end may be. In several late Babylonian texts, compositions from the first millennium BC that draw on much older traditions, there is a description of the location where the tablets of destiny ultimately reside in the settled cosmic order after all the conflicts and thefts and recoveries are concluded. They are kept, these texts say, in the innermost chamber of the great temple, not displayed, not publicly accessible, not available for consultation by ordinary worshippers or even ordinary priests. They are in the dark, in a room within a room, within a room, guarded, sealed, present, but inaccessible, and the texts that describe this arrangement do not present it as a problem. They present it as correct, as the proper state of affairs, as the way things should be in a world that is functioning as it should. The tablets of destiny are most securely in their place when they are most completely hidden, which means that the knowledge of what is written on them, the content of the inscription that supposedly underlies the structure of reality itself, is knowledge that the cosmos, apparently, keeps to itself. Human beings were given the reading primer. They were given the divinatory arts, the astronomical tables, the me, the fragments of knowledge that Enki distributed from his deep water archive. They were given enough to build cities and write hymns and press stories into clay that would survive 4,000 years of history to be read by people who are still trying to understand them. But the tablets themselves, the original text, the source from which all the fragments derive, remain, in every account that mentions them, somewhere beyond reach, somewhere in the innermost room, somewhere in the dark. And the question that every Mesopotamian diviner, every Sumerian scribe, every researcher who has sat in a museum archive with a magnifying glass and a clay tablet was ultimately asking, whether they framed it that way or not, is whether the text written on those tablets is still, in some form, legible. Whether the inscription at the foundation of things can still be read by someone patient enough and knowledgeable enough to look in the right place. And whether what it says about us, about what we are, why we were made, and where the story goes from here, is something we are ready, after 6,000 years of searching, to finally understand. The inscription at the foundation of things may still be legible, but before we can understand what it says about us, about what we are and why we were made, we have to go back to the moment that made our creation necessary in the first place. Because according to the oldest texts, humanity was not the first attempt at a workforce. We were the solution to a problem, and the problem had a name. It was called the Igigi, and what they did, or what the Sumerian scribes recorded that they did, is one of the most unsettling, most quietly extraordinary, and most consistently overlooked stories in the entire ancient world. There is a tablet in the collection of the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the Museum of the Ancient Near East, that sits in a climate-controlled case alongside hundreds of others, its surface dense with the small, precise wedge marks of old Babylonian cuneiform. It is a fragment, one piece of a larger composition, its edges broken, its beginning and end lost to the millennia that separated its writing from its excavation. But what survives in the middle of that fragment is enough. It is a description of labor, of work performed under conditions of such relentless intensity that the beings performing it could no longer continue. It is, in the most literal sense, a strike notice, written in the language of myth, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. But structurally, unmistakably, a record of organized collective action by workers who had reached the limit of what they were willing to endure. The workers were not human. The work was not agricultural, and the beings who received the notice were not employers in any sense that maps cleanly onto modern understanding. But the dynamic, the exhaustion, the grievance, the collective decision to stop, the confrontation with authority, and the negotiated resolution is so recognizable, so precisely human in its structure, that it stops you. Because if the Sumerians were simply inventing a creation myth, why would they write it this way? To understand the Igigi Rebellion, you have to understand the structure of the divine world as the Sumerians described it. The Anunnaki were not a uniform group. They were a hierarchy. At the top sat Anu, sky, father, ultimate authority, dwelling in the highest celestial realm, largely removed from the day-to-day administration of the world. Below Anu, three great Anunnaki divided governance among themselves. Enlil, lord of the air and earth, governing the surface world and its human inhabitants. Enki, lord of the Abzu, governing the deep waters and the knowledge they contained. And Ninhursag, the Great Mother, associated with the living earth and the processes of biological creation. Below these senior figures were the broader ranks of the Anunnaki, divine beings of varying degrees of power and authority, governing specific domains, cities, natural phenomena, and aspects of human civilization. They are numbered in various texts at anywhere from several dozen to several hundred. And below the Anunnaki were the Igigi. The distinction between the two groups is one of the genuinely puzzling aspects of Mesopotamian theology, because the texts are not entirely consistent about where the line falls. In some compositions, Igigi and Anunnaki are used almost interchangeably as collective terms for the divine beings. In others, and this is the more common usage in the older, more specific texts, the Igigi are a distinct class, a subordinate class. The lesser gods, the worker gods, the ones assigned to perform the physical labor that maintained the world. And in the Atrahasis epic, the most complete account of the events that led to the creation of humanity, it is the Igigi whose rebellion sets everything in motion. The Atrahasis epic opens not with the world as we know it, but with a world in which only gods exist. There are no humans. There is no human labor. Everything that needs to be done to maintain existence, the digging of rivers, the clearing of canals, the maintenance of the irrigation systems that kept the land productive, is done by the Igigi. The text is specific about this. It is not vague divine labor in some symbolic sense. It is physical, demanding, repetitive work. The Igigi carry the basket. They move the earth. They dredge the channels. They work, the text says, for 40 periods, a number that in the Sumerian reckoning suggests an almost geological span of time. 40 ages of unrelenting physical labor performed under the authority of Enlil, with no relief and no end in sight. The conditions described in the text have a texture that goes beyond what a purely symbolic narrative requires. The Igigi do not simply tire. They develop grievances, they discuss their situation among themselves, they reach a collective decision, and then they act. They burn their tools, they surround Enlil's house in the night, they refuse to continue. The text describes the scene with remarkable specificity. It is the middle of the night. Enlil is inside. His vizier, a figure named Nusku, wakes him and tells him that the house is surrounded. Enlil is alarmed. The text uses language that suggests something close to fear. He sends for Anu and Enki. An emergency assembly of the senior Anunnaki is convened in the darkness, while the Igigi wait outside. Enlil's first response is anger. He wants to know who incited the rebellion, who is responsible, who organized it, who should be punished. Anu's response is more measured. He points out that the Igigi's grievance is legitimate. Their labor has been excessive. Their complaints have merit. The question is not who to punish, but what to do. It is Enki who provides the answer. Enki's proposal in the Atrahasis epic is presented as a creative solution to an administrative problem. The Igigi need relief. The work still needs to be done. Therefore create a new kind of being, one specifically designed to perform the labor. Take the burden from the Igigi and transfer it to this new creature. Everyone's problem is solved. The proposal is accepted. Enki and Ninhursag undertake the creation. The process is described in terms that mix the biological and the ceremonial in a way that has fascinated scholars for generations. Clay is taken from above the Abzu. A divine being, identified in some versions as a god who volunteered, in others as a god who was executed for leading the rebellion, is slain. His flesh and blood are mixed with the clay. The mixture is shaped. 14 birth goddesses carry the result to term, and the first human beings emerge, made to work, made specifically to relieve the Igigi of the labor that had broken them. This is, in the starkest possible terms, the Sumerian account of why humanity exists. The theological implications of this account are significant enough that it is worth pausing on them. In the Hebrew tradition, which draws, as scholars have extensively documented, on the same Mesopotamian literary river, humanity is created in the image of the divine, breathed into life by a god who considers the result very good. The relationship between creator and created, whatever its complexities, is framed as one of love, of intentional design, of something approaching paternal care. The Sumerian account is not like that. It is transactional in a way that is almost uncomfortable to read. Humanity is a labor-saving solution, a biological workforce designed to handle the physical maintenance of the world so that divine beings would not have to. The creation of humanity, in this telling, is less an act of divine love than an act of divine convenience. And yet, the Atrahasis epic does not end there, because once humanity is created and set to work, something unexpected happens. Something that Enlil apparently did not fully anticipate. Humanity multiplies and makes noise. The same noise, in fact, that will eventually precipitate the flood. The problem the Igigi Rebellion created, the need for a labor force, generates a new problem. A labor force that grows, that reproduces, that develops its own culture and its own considerable presence in the world. The solution creates the next crisis, and the next crisis requires its own solution. It is a cycle that the Atrahasis epic traces with a kind of resigned narrative logic, as if the scribe who first composed it understood with melancholy clarity that this is simply how things work, that solutions generate problems, that interventions have consequences, that the history of the world is, in significant part, a history of attempts to manage the consequences of previous management decisions. Whether that reads as theology or as something else is a question each reader has to answer for themselves. The identity and nature of the Igigi, beyond their role in the rebellion, is one of the genuinely unresolved puzzles of Mesopotamian studies. As noted, the texts are inconsistent. In some compositions, they appear to be a distinct and clearly subordinate class of divine beings. In others, the term seems to function more as a collective descriptor for divine beings generally, with no hierarchical implication. Some texts use Annunaki and Igigi together as a kind of doublet, a paired formula meaning simply the gods in their totality. But several texts make a distinction that is specific enough to resist the purely interchangeable reading. In these texts, the Igigi are associated with the sky, with a celestial realm distinct from the earthly domain of the senior Anunnaki. The number most frequently associated with them is 300, the 300 Igigi of heaven, contrasted with the 600 Anunnaki of earth, or alternatively the 300 Anunnaki of the underworld. The numerical precision suggests a real distinction of some kind, even if its full nature is no longer recoverable. What is consistent across all appearances of the Igigi in the textual record is their position, below the senior Anunnaki, above humanity, and assigned to forms of work that the senior Anunnaki apparently considered beneath their own station, but were unwilling or unable to perform indefinitely through purely human proxies. They occupy a middle position in a hierarchy whose full extent the texts only partially describe. And it is that middle position, between the gods and humanity, between the celestial and the terrestrial, that has attracted the most intense attention from researchers working outside the mainstream scholarly consensus. The fringe interpretations of the Igigi are, in this area, among the most specific and the most difficult to simply dismiss on grounds of internal incoherence. The ancient astronaut framework, as developed by Sitchin and elaborated by subsequent researchers, proposes that the Igigi were a distinct group of beings, subordinate to the senior Anunnaki in terms of rank, but similar in nature, assigned to specific technical operations related to whatever project had brought the Anunnaki to Earth in the first place. In Sitchin's reading, that project was resource extraction, specifically the mining of gold from the Earth's crust for purposes related to the Anunnaki's home civilization. The Igigi, in this framework, were the operational workforce, the beings who did the actual physical extraction. Their rebellion in this reading is not a metaphor for the need to create humanity. It is a historical event, a labor dispute among beings engaged in a specific industrial operation, resolved by the creation of a genetically engineered workforce capable of doing the physical work without the capacity, or at least without the organized will, to rebel in the same way. The archaeological evidence for large-scale ancient mining operations is, in fact, not limited to speculation. The Lion Cavern in Swaziland, now Eswatini, shows evidence of hematite mining dating to approximately 43,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest known mining operations on Earth. Ancient gold mines have been found across sub-Saharan Africa, in regions that some researchers have attempted to connect to the geographic descriptions in the Sumerian texts. The scale of some of these ancient operations is genuinely puzzling. The labor required to produce them, by the tools and methods that conventional archaeology attributes to the people who created them, is difficult to account for with complete comfort. None of this constitutes proof of anything. The ancient mining operations have conventional archaeological explanations. The connection to the Sumerian texts requires interpretive leaps that mainstream scholarship is not prepared to make. But the questions are real, and they are not going away. There is another dimension of the Igigi story that receives less attention than the rebellion itself, but which may be equally significant. It concerns what happened to the Igigi after the creation of humanity resolved, or appeared to resolve, their labor dispute. They do not disappear from the textual record. They continue to appear in Mesopotamian literature in roles that are difficult to categorize cleanly. In some texts, they are observers, celestial beings who watch the human world from a distance without intervening directly. In others, they interact with humanity in ways that create new complications for the divine order. The most striking of these interactions appears in the Atrahasis epic itself, in a passage that follows the creation of humanity and precedes the flood. As the human population grows and the noise of civilization increases to the point that it disturbs the divine sleep, Enlil attempts a series of population reduction measures: plague, drought, famine. Each time, Enki undermines the attempt by warning humanity. But there is another element to the growing crisis that the text mentions and then moves past with a speed that suggests the scribes considered it either obvious or too sensitive to dwell on. The Igigi, according to several textual traditions that intersect with the Atrahasis narrative, did not maintain the distant observer role that their post-rebellion position should have assigned them. Some of them came down. The Book of Enoch, a text from the Hebrew tradition, not Sumerian, but drawing on the same Mesopotamian literary tradition, describes this descent in detail that has no direct Sumerian parallel, but reflects a story pattern that appears in fragmentary form across multiple ancient Near Eastern sources. Divine beings, called the Watchers in the Enoch tradition, a term that some scholars have connected to the Igigi, descended to Earth, took human wives, and produced offspring whose nature and behavior further complicated the already strained relationship between the divine and human worlds. The Sumerian texts do not tell this story as directly as the Enochian tradition does. But the pattern, the Igigi as beings who were supposed to remain in a specific position in the hierarchy, and who, at least in some accounts, did not, threads through enough independent sources to suggest that it encodes something the ancient traditions considered important. What that something was: a memory of actual events, a theological explanation for the existence of anomalous human characteristics, a mythological processing of some real historical disruption, remains genuinely open. If the Igigi Rebellion raises one question above all others, it is this. What does it mean that the oldest creation story in the world describes humanity as a labor-saving device? It is worth sitting with the discomfort of that question without rushing to resolve it. The Sumerians were not a people who told stories carelessly. They were not a culture that reached for whatever narrative was convenient and pressed it into clay without reflection. The civilization that produced the world's first legal code, the world's first literary author, the world's first astronomical tables. That civilization did not stumble accidentally into a creation narrative. They preserved it, copied it, recited it, elaborated it across centuries. It meant something to them, something important enough to keep. And what it says, in the clearest possible terms, is that we were not the first attempt. That before us, there were others. That those others had a breaking point. That our existence is, in some sense, the consequence of their refusal to continue. The Igigi are gone now, or withdrawn, or transformed, or waiting in whatever the celestial equivalent of retirement looks like. The work they refused to do, humanity has been doing ever since. Building, digging, maintaining, organizing, the endless labor of civilization that began in the river valleys of Mesopotamia and has not stopped for 6,000 years. Whether we were designed for that labor or simply adapted to it. Whether the divine material mixed into the clay at our creation was a gift or a limitation. The thing that made us capable of building ziggurats and writing hymns and pressing questions into clay, or the thing that bound us to a role we never fully chose. Whether the Igigi, wherever they are, look at what we have become, at the cities and the libraries and the particle accelerators and the telescopes pointed at the edges of the universe, and see the successful completion of a workforce program. Or whether they see something that surprised everyone, including the beings who made us. That is the question the Atrahasis epic raises and declines to answer. The question that sits at the foundation of the oldest story about human origins ever written, patient and unresolved, waiting for an answer that 4,000 years of civilization have not yet conclusively produced. What are we really? And did anyone, divine, celestial, or otherwise, fully anticipate what we would become? Perhaps they did anticipate it. Perhaps that is precisely why, before humanity was set loose in the world with all its energy and its noise and its relentless capacity for multiplication, something else was prepared first. A set of tools, a framework, a collection of powers and principles and knowledge so comprehensive that it covered every dimension of civilized existence, from the most elevated forms of divine authority down to the most practical skills of daily life. Something that would shape what humanity became, and how, and in what direction. Something that would ensure, whatever else happened, that the project produced a specific kind of result. The Sumerians called it the Me. And the more carefully you look at what the texts say about it, the harder it becomes to decide whether you are reading about a theological concept, an administrative system, or something that has no clean modern category at all. In the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, one of the great archaeological collections in the world, housing tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets excavated from the ancient sites of Mesopotamia over more than a century of fieldwork. There is a collection of tablets that preserves across multiple fragments in multiple hands the text scholars call Inanna and Enki. It is not the most famous text in the collection. It does not have the narrative drama of the Epic of Gilgamesh or the cosmological sweep of the Enuma Elish. But among specialists in Sumerian literature, it occupies a peculiar place of fascination because embedded within its story is something that exists nowhere else in the ancient world with quite the same clarity. A list. Not a list of kings, or a list of offerings, or a list of goods transferred between temples and administrative centers. A list of everything. Every power, every institution, every skill, every form of authority, every capacity for experience, positive and negative, creative and destructive, sacred and profane, that the Sumerians believed made civilization what it was. It is the list of the me, and reading it, even in translation, even at a distance of 4,000 years, produces a feeling that is difficult to name precisely. Something between awe and unease. The feeling of looking at something that was not meant to be a list at all, but a blueprint. The word me is one of those Sumerian terms that resists clean translation because what it describes does not have a clean equivalent in modern conceptual vocabulary. Scholars have tried divine laws, sacred offices, civilizational powers, cosmic principles, cultural norms, divine attributes. Each of these captures something. None captures everything. What the texts make clear, consistently and across multiple independent compositions, is that the me are not ideas. They are not abstract principles floating in some theological ether. They are things. They have physical presence. They can be collected, stored, carried, stolen, given away, received, and held. They have weight and reality in the Sumerian world that purely conceptual entities do not possess. Enki keeps them in the Abzu, not as a metaphor for divine wisdom, but as a literal custodial arrangement. They are stored there, in his keeping, the way important objects are stored in a treasury. They can be loaded onto a boat, as they are in the Inanna and Enki text, and transported from one city to another. They can be threatened by rough water. They can be grabbed and pulled back. Whatever the me were, they occupied physical space. The list preserved in the Inanna and Enki text runs, in the most complete surviving versions, to over 100 individual items. They are presented without obvious organizational logic, or rather, with an organizational logic that has not yet been fully decoded, because the sequence of items seems deliberate, but the principle of the sequence is not transparent to modern readers. The list begins with high divine offices and descends through increasingly specific human capacities and experiences. It opens with endship, the highest form of priestly royal authority, and the throne of kingship. It includes godship itself, the great and enduring crown, the royal insignia, the scepter, the staff, the holy measuring rod and line. These are the instruments and symbols of supreme authority, the objects and capacities that define the apex of the social order. Then the list moves into something more complex. Truth, descent to the underworld and ascent from it, the musical instruments, the kugelmandu, the algar, the balag drum, the art of heroism and the art of power, victory and the instruments of war, the black garment and the colorful garment, the loosening of hair and the binding of hair, the standard and the quiver. And then something shifts in the list, and it becomes genuinely strange. Because mixed in among the institutions and the symbols and the ritual objects are things that seem less like powers and more like experiences. The art of forthright speech, the art of slanderous speech, the kindling of fire and the extinguishing of fire, wisdom and understanding, the craft of the scribe, the art of the smith and the leatherworker and the builder, the art of music and the art of lamentation. But also, the descent to the underworld, deliberate falsehood, the troubled heart, the art of prostitution, the holy tavern. The me are not exclusively elevated. They include the full range of human experience, including the parts of that experience that are dark, destructive, or morally ambiguous. The Sumerians did not edit the list to make civilization look noble. They recorded what civilization actually contains. And what it contains, apparently, includes deliberate falsehood, troubled hearts, and the full spectrum of human behavior from the most sacred to the most base. Whatever gave humanity the me gave it everything. Not just the capacity for building and music and wisdom, but the capacity for deception and grief and the particular kind of despair that sends someone to the tavern at the edge of the sacred district. If this was a gift, it was an honest one. The narrative frame that preserves the list, the story of Inanna's journey to Eridu and her acquisition of the me from Enki, deserves its own careful attention because its details complicate any purely symbolic reading of what the Mi actually are. Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki. She is the goddess of love and war, the queen of heaven, the most widely worshipped deity in the Mesopotamian world. She is not a minor figure coming to pay respects to a superior. She is a major power in her own right, arriving at the source of something she wants. Enki receives her with extraordinary hospitality. The feast is lavish. The beer, a sacred substance in Sumerian culture associated with civilization itself, flows generously. And as the feast progresses and the atmosphere loosens, Enki begins to give. He presents Inanna with the Mi, one by one, with the formal language of genuine transfer. He says the words. He hands them over. She receives them. The text does not say Enki is drunk in so many words. This has been debated among scholars for decades. But the implication of the scene is clear enough that most readers across most periods have understood it as the decisive factor. Something about the occasion, the feasting, the presence of Inanna, produces in Enki a generosity that his sober judgment would not have permitted. And then he sobers and realizes that the Mi are gone. What follows is one of the most vivid chase sequences in ancient literature. Enki sends his messenger, Isimud, a being depicted in Sumerian art as having two faces, looking in opposite directions simultaneously, to intercept Inanna's boat before she reaches Uruk. Isimud is instructed to reclaim the Mi by whatever means necessary, short of harming Inanna directly. He fails 6 times. In the text's repetitive incantatory structure, Isimud intercepts the boat. 6 times, Inanna repels him. She invokes the name of Enki against his own messenger, using the authority of the transfer itself as her defense, pointing out that what was freely given cannot be legitimately taken back. The 7th time, she reaches Uruk. The Mi are unloaded, distributed into the city, and from Uruk, presumably, they disperse further, into the wider world of Mesopotamian civilization, into the cities and temples and institutions that will carry specific capacities forward through the millennia. The Mi are no longer centralized. They are loose in the world, and the world from that point forward is a more complicated place. Mainstream scholarship reads the Inanna and Enki narrative as a mythological account of cultural transmission, specifically the spread of civilization from the oldest city, Eridu, to the expanding network of Sumerian urban centers. Uruk, where Inanna brings the Mi, was in the historical period around 3500 to 3000 BC, the largest city in the world, a sprawling, complex urban environment whose scale and organizational sophistication represented a genuine leap in the history of human civilization. The story of the Mi traveling from Eridu to Uruk encodes, in this reading, the historical reality of cultural knowledge spreading from one center to another. This is a persuasive and well-grounded interpretation. It fits the historical context. It accounts for the narrative structure. It explains why the story was preserved and retold. It was, among other things, a foundation myth for the cultural authority of Uruk and the institutions associated with Inanna. But it does not fully account for the physical specificity of the Mi in the text. The way they are loaded onto a boat, the way their transfer is treated as a formal legal act requiring specific language, the way Enki's attempt to recover them is portrayed as a genuine procedural dispute rather than a simple exercise of superior divine authority. If the Mi were purely symbolic of cultural knowledge, the story's insistence on their physical transferability, their loadability, their carryability, their vulnerability to rough water during transit, introduces a level of material detail that the symbolic reading has to work around, rather than through. The text seemed to want the Mi to be both conceptual and physical simultaneously, to be in some way that the Sumerians apparently found natural and that we find difficult to categorize, both the principle and the embodiment of the principle in a single object. What kind of thing has that dual nature? What exists in the world as both a capacity and a physical instantiation of that capacity? It is a question that opens onto several different kinds of answers, depending on which framework you bring to it. The fringe interpretations of the me tend to focus precisely on their physical properties, on the insistence, across multiple independent texts, that these were real objects that could be held and carried and stored. Some researchers working within the ancient technology framework have proposed that the me were devices of some kind, physical instruments whose possession conferred practical capabilities, not mystical powers, but actual tools. Instruments whose function we would, if we encountered them today, describe in technological rather than theological terms. The art of metalworking as a me, in this reading, is not just the conceptual capacity for metallurgy. It is a physical guide, a manual, a set of instruments or templates whose possession gave a metallurgist capabilities they would not otherwise have. Extended to its logical conclusion, this framework suggests that the me were something like a complete technological library, a set of physical objects, each encoding or enabling a specific human capacity, stored in Enki's facility at Eridu and gradually distributed into human civilization over the period that the texts describe. The objection to this reading is that it collapses the theological into the technological in ways that require significant assumptions about the nature of the Anunnaki and their relationship to human civilization. Assumptions that go well beyond what the texts, even generously read, can support. But there is a version of this interpretation that requires fewer assumptions and remains genuinely interesting. What if the me were records? Not mystical powers, not advanced devices, but simply information, organized, physical, portable information in a format that the Sumerians experienced as something close to magical, because the knowledge it contained was so far beyond what they possessed independently that the gap felt divine. In that reading, Enki's custody of the me is the custody of a library. His Abzu is an archive. The transfer of the Emi to Inanna is the copying or transfer of records. And what spread from Eridu to Uruk and then to the wider world of Mesopotamian civilization was not supernatural power, but organized knowledge, the kind of knowledge that, in the hands of a population that did not previously possess it, would have functioned as transformatively as any miracle. This is not a fringe interpretation. It is, in many respects, closer to the mainstream than the alternative. But it carries within it a question that the mainstream framing tends to leave unasked. Where did the knowledge in the archive come from? The me are not described as accumulated. They are described as original, present from the beginning, or at least from a beginning so early in the divine order that no human or divine tradition claims to remember a time before them. Enki does not develop them over time through study and observation. He keeps them. He is their custodian, not their author. If he did not create them, and the texts do not suggest that any other named divine being created them, then the question of their origin is genuinely open, and it connects, with an architectural precision that feels less like coincidence and more like design, to the tablets of destiny, to the possibility that the me are themselves derivatives of something more fundamental. Practical applications of principles encoded at a level so deep that only the tablets of destiny contain them in their original form. The me as the user-facing layer of a system whose underlying code is written somewhere else entirely. It is a metaphor, but it is a metaphor that the Sumerian texts seem, in their own way, to be reaching for. There is one me in the list that deserves particular attention, because it appears in a position that suggests the Sumerians considered it foundational to everything else. It appears near the beginning of the list, alongside the highest divine offices and the instruments of kingship, in a position that implies proximity to the apex of the civilizational order. It is the me of the descent to the underworld, and the ascent from it. This is not a metaphor for death and resurrection in a purely spiritual sense, though it carries that meaning too. In the Sumerian cosmological system, the underworld, the realm they called the Kur, or the Great Below, was a real place with its own governance, its own population, its own rules. The ability to descend into it and return was not a common capability. It was, in the fullest Sumerian understanding, the ultimate test of whatever power a being possessed, the measure of whether that power extended even to the domain of irreversibility, that this capacity appears as a me, as something transferable, learnable, physically embodied, suggests that the Sumerians did not consider it purely miraculous. It was a skill, or a technology, or a form of knowledge whose acquisition, through the right channels, made what seemed impossible become possible. Inanna herself undergoes the descent in a separate myth, the famous descent of Inanna, and the account of what she encounters there and how she survives it is one of the most structurally sophisticated narratives in all of ancient literature. But she survives it and returns, and the me of the descent and ascent is part of what makes that survival possible. Whatever the Sumerians meant by the underworld and the journey through it, whether they meant it literally, metaphorically, or in some mode of understanding that we no longer have clean access to, they believed the capacity to navigate it was real, that it could be possessed, that Enki had it in his keeping, and that it was among the most significant things he gave away. The complete list of the me, taken as a whole, is a portrait of a civilization. Not an idealized civilization, not a spiritual aspiration, but a full spectrum account of what human civilization actually is. Its heights and its depths, its sacred institutions and its most human failures, its capacity for beauty and its equal capacity for deception and grief. Whoever compiled that list understood humanity with a completeness that is, itself, slightly unsettling. They did not flinch from the darker entries. They did not try to present civilization as only its best moments. They recorded the troubled heart alongside the throne of kingship. They listed the art of lamentation alongside the art of music. They included deliberate falsehood alongside truth. This is not the portrait of humanity that a culture creates when it is mythologizing itself into nobility. It is the portrait of humanity as seen from outside, with the clarity and the dispassion of a very long view. As if whoever assembled this list had observed human beings long enough and carefully enough to know exactly what we are, in every register, without illusion. Who, among everything the ancient world produced, had that kind of perspective? The Sumerians believed they knew the answer, the keeper of the list, the custodian of the Abzu, the one who, when the assembly decided to destroy what humanity had become, found a way to preserve what was worth preserving. Not because he was sentimental, but because he understood with the clarity of complete knowledge that what had been given was worth keeping. Enki held the me. He held the blueprint of civilization. He understood better than anyone what humanity was capable of. The full range of it, the troubled hearts and the sacred hymns together. And perhaps that is the most quietly remarkable thing in the entire Sumerian tradition. Not that the me existed, not that they were given, but that the being who held them, who knew what they contained and what they would produce, chose, against the wishes of his own council, in violation of his own oath, to make sure we survived. Whatever we are, workforce, experiment, inheritance, or something that exceeded every expectation. Someone who understood us completely decided we were worth the trouble. And the question that the me, in their long, honest, unsparing list of everything that humanity is, quietly insists on asking is this: were they right? Someone decided we were worth the trouble, and they built us a home to prove it. Not a metaphorical home, not a spiritual origin point in the abstract sense that every culture assigns to some sacred geography as a way of anchoring its identity to the earth. A real city, with real foundations that can be measured and dated and walked across, if you know where to look and are willing to make the journey to one of the more remote and inhospitable corners of the southern Iraqi desert. A city that the Sumerians did not claim to have built themselves. A city that the oldest texts describe as having been established not by human hands, but by divine decision. Lowered from heaven to earth at the beginning of time, planted in the mud at the edge of the primordial waters, and given to humanity as the first place. The original city. The city before all cities. Its name was Eridu, and what lies beneath its surface, what has already been uncovered, and what almost certainly has not, represents one of the most extraordinary and least visited archaeological sites in the entire ancient world. Drive south from Nasiriyah in modern Iraq, through a landscape that has been surrendering to desert for millennia, past the ruins of Ur on your left and the flat, pale emptiness of the former marshlands on your right. The road deteriorates. The vegetation disappears. The sky becomes very large and very white in the way that desert skies do when the sun is overhead and the land beneath offers nothing to interrupt its dominance. And then, rising from the flat plain with a modesty entirely disproportionate to its historical significance, you see the mound. Tel Abu Sharain, it is called on modern maps, a low, irregular elevation in the landscape, not dramatic, not immediately impressive, not the kind of thing that announces its importance to a casual observer. You could drive past it without slowing down. Many people have. But stop. Get out of the vehicle. Stand at the edge of the excavation areas that remain exposed from the work done in the 1940s and again in later decades. Look at the stratigraphy visible in the trench walls. The layers of human occupation compressed into the earth beneath your feet like pages in a book that someone has been pressing for 6,000 years. What you are standing on is the oldest continuously occupied site in the history of human civilization. The deepest layers here reach back to approximately 5400 BC by conventional dating. And some researchers believe the earliest occupation may be older still, in strata not yet fully excavated or dated. The city that grew from those first settlements lasted in one form or another for thousands of years. It was ancient when Babylon was young. It was remembered as primordial when the scribes of Ur were composing the texts that first preserved its name for posterity. Eridu did not just come first. It came so far first that the gap between it and everything that followed is, in archaeological terms, almost vertiginous. The excavations at Eridu that were carried out by Iraqi archaeologists Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd beginning in 1946 produced results that reshaped the understanding of Mesopotamian prehistory. Quietly, without generating the public attention their significance deserved, because the years that followed were not kind to either the region or the academic infrastructure required to pursue the work further. What Safar and Lloyd found was not one temple. It was 18. Built directly on top of each other in an unbroken sequence of religious construction extending from the earliest occupation levels to the later historical periods. The same sacred ground, consecrated again and again across thousands of years. Each generation of builders demolishing or partially burying the previous structure and erecting a new one in its place, maintaining a continuity of sacred purpose so persistent that it constitutes in itself a remarkable piece of evidence. Evidence of what? That is the question. At minimum, it is evidence that the people who lived at Eridu across those thousands of years agreed, generation after generation without apparent interruption, that this specific place was worth maintaining as a sacred site. That whatever was being honored here was worth honoring continuously. That the tradition did not lapse, did not transfer to a more convenient location, did not get absorbed into the religious systems of the newer, larger, more powerful cities that rose around it. At maximum, it is evidence that something at this location, the freshwater springs that made it habitable in an otherwise saline landscape, the specific quality of the place at the edge of the primordial marshes, the proximity to whatever the Abzu represented in physical terms, retained a significance that later religious systems could replace, but could not quite replicate. The earliest temple at Eridu, the structure at the very bottom of the sequence, the one built first on the bare earth of the original settlement, is so small that it might easily be dismissed. It is a single room, roughly 3 meters by 4. It has an offering table. It has a niche that would have held a cult image. Its floor is covered with the bones of fish. Offerings, apparently, left for whatever was being worshipped in this room at the beginning of the world's first city. Fish bones on the floor of the world's first temple. The most ancient act of worship that archaeology has yet uncovered. Enki was the god of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean. His sacred animal was the fish. His priests, in the later historical periods, wore robes designed to resemble fish, a costume so specific and so persistent that it appears in Assyrian relief carvings more than 3,000 years after the first fish bones were left on the floor of that first small room. The continuity is not symbolic, it is physical, unbroken. From the first room to the last temple, across 60 centuries of human religious practice, the same association maintained, the same offering repeated, the same sacred direction observed. Whatever began in that first room did not end when the room was buried and rebuilt. It continued. It insisted on continuing. And the people who came after, generation after generation, let it. The Sumerian king list says that kingship, the organizing principle of civilized human society, descended from heaven and was first established at Eridu. The first king of the world, Alulim, ruled at Eridu. Whatever the reign lengths mean, whatever the nature of those antediluvian rulers, the text is explicit that this is where it started. This is not merely a Sumerian claim. A related tradition, preserved in the Babylonian writings of a priest named Berossus, who was recording Mesopotamian history for a Greek-speaking audience around 290 BC, states that the first city given to humanity was Babylon, which by his period had long since eclipsed Eridu in cultural and political importance. But in the older Sumerian sources that predate Berossus by 2,000 years, the primacy of Eridu is consistent and uncontested. It is the first city, the original city, the city before the flood, the city where the Anunnaki first established the institutions of human civilization, where the Mi were kept before they were distributed, where Enki built the Abzu and stored the knowledge that would eventually find its way into the hands of the scribes and diviners and craftsmen of Mesopotamia's great urban age. And here is a detail that tends to get lost in the larger sweep of the Eridu story. In the period just before the city was abandoned, sometime around 2000 BC, during the same civilizational disruption that ended the Sumerian world as it had existed for millennia, the last builders at Eridu did something that the excavators found deeply puzzling. They buried the ziggurat. Not completely. Not in the way that Göbekli Tepe was buried. Deliberately filled in, sealed, hidden. But the final building phases at Eridu show evidence of careful, intentional entombment of specific structures. As if the last people to tend this place understood that it was ending, that the long continuity of sacred occupation was about to break, and chose to seal what had been built rather than simply walk away. They left it ready, preserved, as if it might be needed again. The water is the key to everything at Eridu, and it is worth spending time on the physical reality of what made this place singular in the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. The southern Iraqi plain in the 5th millennium BC was not the uniform desert it appears today. It was a complex, dynamic environment, part dry land, part river delta, part freshwater marsh, part salt flat, threaded through with waterways that shifted seasonally and over longer geological periods. It was a landscape of transitions, of boundaries between wet and dry, fresh and salt, habitable and uninhabitable. Eridu sat at one of the most significant of these transitions. It occupied a point where fresh water, rising from the underground aquifer, seeping up through the alluvial soil in springs and seeps, met the surrounding salinity of the near-coastal environment. In practical terms, this made it one of the few places in the southern plain where fresh water was reliably available without dependence on the river flood cycles. In symbolic terms, in the Sumerian understanding of the world, it placed Eridu precisely at the boundary between the Abzu and the surface world, between the underground freshwater ocean and the land, between Enki's domain and everything else. This was not a metaphor that was later attached to a convenient location. The location chose the metaphor. The physical reality of freshwater rising from beneath the earth at this specific spot is what made Eridu the place it was. What drew the first settlers, what sustained the first temple, what made it coherent to say that Enki lived here. He lived here because the water that defined him was here, not symbolically. Actually. And when the hydrology changed, as it inevitably did over millennia as sea levels shifted and the water table fluctuated and the marshlands contracted and expanded. Eridu's relationship to that defining water changed too. The fresh water that had made it habitable and sacred gradually became less reliable. The city that had begun at the very edge of the life-giving water slowly found itself further from it. And eventually, the long calculation that cities make between resources and population and infrastructure tipped against it. Eridu was abandoned. Slowly, over centuries, rather than suddenly. But abandoned nonetheless. The world's first city, the city of Enki, the city before all cities, left to the desert, left to the salt flats, left to the particular silence of places that were once full of human life and are now full of nothing but the evidence that they were. The fringe interpretations of Eridu's significance tend to cluster around two related questions that the conventional archaeological account, for all its rigor, does not fully address. The first is the question of what lies beneath the lowest excavated levels. Safar and Lloyd's excavations reach the earliest Ubaid occupation layers, the period dating to approximately 5400 BC, but they did not excavate to bedrock. The practical constraints of archaeology, time, funding, the risk of destabilizing upper layers to reach lower ones, mean that the absolute bottom of the Eridu sequence has not been reached. What lies beneath the earliest excavated levels is, in the most literal sense, unknown. This is not a dramatic claim. It is simply a fact of the archaeology. The site has not been fully excavated. There are layers that have not been reached. What those layers contain is an open question to which the answer is, at present, genuinely unknown. The second question concerns the Ubaid culture itself, the civilization from which Eridu and the other earliest Mesopotamian sites emerged. The Ubaid people are something of an archaeological enigma. They appear in the record with a level of cultural and organizational sophistication that, by the conventional developmental model, should have been preceded by a longer period of simpler cultural forms. That simpler period is, in the Eridu sequence and in the broader Ubaid distribution, either very brief or not yet found. Where did the Ubaid culture come from? Who were the people who built the first temple at Eridu, left the fish bones on its floor, and initiated 6,000 years of continuous sacred occupation at this specific site? The mainstream answer is that they were indigenous to the region, a population that developed in the marshlands and river valleys of southern Mesopotamia, and whose cultural elaboration accelerated when they settled at sites like Eridu. This is a reasonable position, and the archaeological evidence does not directly contradict it. But there is a persistent alternative suggestion, advanced by several researchers including the archaeologist Jeffrey Rose, that the Ubaid population may have included or been significantly influenced by people displaced from the flooded Persian Gulf basin, the drowned river valley that lies beneath the waters of the modern Gulf, which was above sea level and inhabited during the preceding period. If a sophisticated population was displaced northward by the gradual flooding of that basin, their arrival in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia would account for the apparent cultural precocity of the Ubaid, the sense that the foundational Mesopotamian civilization arrives already knowing things it should not yet know. This hypothesis remains contested. The archaeological evidence from the Gulf Basin is difficult to access by definition. Most of it lies underwater. But the geological evidence for the flooding is solid. The basin was above water. People lived there. The water rose. They went somewhere. If Eridu was founded in part by people carrying the memory, and perhaps the practical knowledge, of a civilization that existed before the flooding, then the Sumerian tradition of Eridu as the city before the flood takes on a different kind of resonance. Not purely mythological, not purely literal, but something in between, a memory of real events, encoded in the language of a tradition that understood itself as the continuation of something much older than its own beginnings. There is a text from the later Babylonian period, a ritual text concerned with the proper conduct of certain sacred ceremonies, that contains a passage describing Eridu in terms that feel less like historical memory and more like longing. It describes the city as it was in the beginning, when the Abzu was clean and the great gods dwelt within it, when the first temple stood at the edge of the primordial waters, and the me were whole, and the divine order was intact. It describes it in the past tense, as something that was, as something that the ritual being performed is in some sense attempting to reach back toward, to touch the origin point, to re-establish the connection to whatever Eridu represented at its fullest. The text was written long after Eridu had been abandoned, long after the Sumerian language had ceased to be spoken as a living tongue and survived only in the scribal schools where it was maintained, artificially, as the language of sacred literature. Long after the world that produced the first fishbone offering on the floor of the first small temple had been replaced by several successive worlds, each further from the freshwater edge where everything started. And still, the scribes who wrote that ritual text knew the name, remembered the place, returned to it in their language when they wanted to touch something foundational, something true, something that preceded everything that had come after and, in some sense, authorized it. Eridu persisted in memory long after it ceased to exist as a city, and it persists still, in the ruins that sit in the southern Iraqi desert, in the cuneiform texts in the museums of London and Philadelphia and Istanbul and Baghdad, in the long scholarly argument about what the Ubaid people knew and where they came from and why the first thing they built, at the very first settlement, in the very first layer of the world's oldest city, was a temple. Not a granary, not a house, not a defensive wall. A temple, a small room with an offering table and a niche for a sacred image and fish bones on the floor. And the question that room has been asking, from the moment it was built to the moment archaeologists uncovered it, and will continue asking for as long as the site remains incompletely excavated, is the same question that every layer of Eridu asks in its own way. What were they honoring here? What was present at this specific location, in this specific meeting of fresh water and desert, that was worth 18 successive temples and 60 centuries of continuous sacred attention? What was in the Abzu? And is any of it, the knowledge, the me, the records of a world before the flood, the deep freshwater archive of everything Enki kept, still down there? Beneath the last buried temple, beneath the earliest excavated layers, beneath the floor of a small room where someone left fish bones in the dark and waited for an answer, still waiting, perhaps, in the deep water. Where the answer, if there is one, has always been,